the shadow of a country vicarage, a historian lies dead beside poisoned roses, killed by a weapon that vanished like smoke. All clues point to the village doctor, but Miss Jane Marple sees the truth they miss. The untouched watch, the woman's footprint in the dew, and a grandfather clock whose hands lie. Why was the victim asking about unexpected deaths from 50 years ago? Who forged blackmail letters in the doctor's hand? And as Miss Marple sips her tea, she realizes the killer isn't just covering up one murder, but three. Can a knitting old lady unravel a conspiracy woven with poison, forgery, and time itself before the killer silences her too? The final secret isn't in the evidence. It's in the silence between the ticks of the clock.
Chapter 1. A Murder in the Vicar's Garden. The morning sun, a pale gold coin tossed into a sky washed clean by overnight rain, gilded the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Dew still clung, diamond bright, to the roses in Miss Jane Marple's small, meticulously tended garden. She sat, as was her custom, at her window overlooking the lane, a cup of China tea warming her hands, her gaze drifting over the familiar, peaceful scene. Birds chirped with cheerful abandon, a milk clattered down the cobbles, and old Mr. Jenkins shuffled towards the post office, his pipe sending little puffs of smoke into the still air. It was a picture of English village tranquility, the kind Miss Marple cherished and understood intimately. Then the tranquility shattered. It wasn't a scream, not initially. It was a sound more profound, a deep, guttural cry of utter disbelief and horror that ripped through the morning calm, originating from the direction of the vicarage. Miss Marple set her teacup down with a sharp click on its saucer, her placid expression tightening into one of focused attention. She knew that voice. It was the Reverend Caleb Binnings, a man whose usual tone was one of gentle, scholarly persuasion, not raw terror. Moments later, the frantic pealing of the vicarage bell began, its clanging a discordant summons that echoed through the lanes. Doors opened, heads appeared. Miss Marple, moving with a speed that belied her years, grabbed her lightweight cardigan and her sensible walking shoes. She knew, with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach, that something dreadful had happened. The bell wasn't for a fire. It was the village's age-old signal for death. By the time she reached the vicarage gate, a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by the bell and the vicar's anguished cries. Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed arbiter of social propriety and chief gossip, was already there, her face pale beneath its usual layer of powder, clutching her gloves. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, emerged from his car parked haphazardly by the gate, his medical bag in hand, his expression grimly professional. Young Constable Peters, looking flustered and overwhelmed, was trying, with limited success, to keep people back. "Calm now, calm, everyone," Peter stammered, his face red. "Let the doctor through. Let the vicar have some air." Reverend Binnings stood just inside the garden gate, his normally neat clerical collar askew, his face ashen. He pointed a trembling finger towards the rear of the garden, where vibrant rose bushes formed a vibrant, colorful backdrop. "There, behind the peace rose. Oh, dear God," he choked, unable to continue. Dr. Haydock, ignoring the crowd, strode purposefully down the gravel path that wound through the vicarage garden. Miss Marple, with a quiet determination that allowed no argument, followed close behind. The others, held back by a combination of Peter's flustered authority and a morbid fascination, watched from the gate. The garden was the Reverend's pride and joy. Neatly edged borders overflowed with summer blooms, lupins standing tall, delphiniums a spire of blue, and everywhere roses. The air was thick with their scent, cloying and sweet, now mingling with something else, something metallic and wrong. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the ground as she walked, noting the pristine gravel, the neatly trimmed lawn edges. Everything spoke of order, of care. Then she saw it. Tucked behind a large, perfectly formed bush of the pale yellow peace rose, almost hidden by its lush foliage, lay the body of a man. He was sprawled awkwardly, face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something, the other trapped beneath him. He wore an impeccably tailored dark gray suit, the fabric expensive and unrumpled despite his position. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, gleamed incongruously in the dappled sunlight filtering through the rose leaves. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his movements economical and precise. He felt for a pulse in the neck, then gently lifted an eyelid. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he looked up, his face grave. "He's gone, Caleb. Quite dead. Been dead several hours, I'd say. Dawn, perhaps." He carefully noted the position, the lack of obvious wounds visible from that angle. "No sign of a struggle here, but we'll need to turn him." Reverend Bennings swayed, and Miss Marple, stepping forward unobtrusively, placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Steady now, Reverend. Steady." "Who is it?" The vicar swallowed hard, his voice a dry rasp. It's Mr. Alistair Finch. He was staying at the Grange, arrived only last week, said he was researching local history for a book." "Alistair Finch," Ms. Marple murmured, the name clicking into place. She recalled seeing him at church the previous Sunday, a man in his late 50s, perhaps, with an air of quiet prosperity, a well-groomed beard, and eyes that seemed to miss little. He'd stood out, not just for his city clothes, but for the intensity of his gaze as he surveyed the congregation. "Researching local history, you say?" "Yes," Bennings nodded, trying to collect himself. "Spent quite a bit of time in the church records. Asked about the old manor house ruins, the Saxon burial mound. Seemed very knowledgeable, actually. Polite, but reserved." Dr. Haydock, assisted now by a more composed Constable Peters, carefully turned the body over. Ms. Marple watched, her gaze sweeping the scene with meticulous attention. The victim's face was partially visible beneath the beard, contorted in a rictus of surprise or pain. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the rose petals above him. And there, clearly visible on the temple, partially obscured by a matting of dark blood and a few dislodged rose petals, was a small, neat puncture wound. "Good heavens," Haydock breathed, leaning closer. "What caused that? Looks almost like an ice pick or a very thin stiletto." He gently probed the area around the wound. No powder burns, so not a bullet. Something narrow, sharp, driven in with considerable force. Death would have been instantaneous or very nearly so. Constable Peters paled visibly. "Murder, then? Definitely murder, Doctor?" "I'd say so, Peters," Haydock stated flatly. "No accident leaves a wound like that. And the position, tucked away back here? Doesn't look like a robbery gone wrong, does it?" He gestured towards the victim's pockets. Peters, taking the hint, carefully began to pat them down. He pulled out a slim, expensive-looking leather wallet, still bulging. Inside, a thick wad of banknotes was clearly visible. On the victim's wrist, a heavy gold watch with a complex face ticked steadily away, undisturbed. "Wallet full," Peters announced, his voice shaky. "Watch still there. Ring." He pointed to a signet ring on the victim's little finger. "Still on his finger. Nothing seems taken, Doctor."
"Indeed," Haydock murmured, his brow furrowed. "Very odd. Why kill a man like this, in such a specific way, and leave valuables untouched? Personal, perhaps? Very personal." He looked around the immediate area. No weapon visible. Must have been taken by the killer. Ms. Marple, meanwhile, had been conducting her own silent survey. While the doctor and constable focused on the body and the obvious, her eyes traversed the ground with the precision of a naturalist examining a specimen. The gravel path near the body was undisturbed, save for the marks left by the victim himself and now the doctor and constable. But just beyond the edge of the gravel, where the soft, dark earth of the rose border began, she saw it. A partial footprint. Not a clear boot print, but the distinct impression of a heel, and the faint curved line suggesting the sole of a woman's shoe. It wasn't deep, but it was there, pressed into the damp earth where someone had stepped off the path to approach the rose bush. The soil type was slightly different here, loamier, recently turned, making the impression more defined than it might have been on the lawn. It faced towards the bush, towards the spot where Alistair Finch had fallen. The size suggested a small to average foot. The style? Difficult to be certain from the partial print, but the curve hinted at something more elegant than a sturdy walking shoe or boot. Perhaps a court shoe, or a low-heeled pump. It was a tiny detail, easily overlooked, especially in the shock of the discovery. But to Miss Marple, it was a discordant note in the otherwise pristine scene. Why would a woman be stepping off the path onto the soft earth behind the peace rose in the pre-dawn darkness? And why had no one else noticed it? She straightened up, her expression still one of gentle concern, but her mind was racing. The untouched valuables argued against robbery. The specific, brutal wound suggested premeditation, perhaps even a message. The hidden location implied secrecy. And now this footprint, a woman's footprint. It opened up a vista of possibilities the constable, already muttering about tramps or mysterious strangers from the city, hadn't even begun to consider. Dr. Haydock rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his trousers. "Well, Peters, there's nothing more we can do here until the inspector arrives from Milchester. You'd better telephone him immediately and cordon off this area. No one comes in or out of this part of the garden without my say-so or the inspector's. Understood?" "Yes, doctor. Right away, doctor." Peters scurried off, relieved to have a clear task. Haydock turned to the Reverend Binnings, who was leaning heavily against a garden bench, looking utterly spent. "Caleb, I'm dreadfully sorry. This is a terrible shock. Is there someone? Mrs. Binnings? Should I—" Binnings shook his head. "Esther is visiting her sister in Cheltenham, not due back until tomorrow." "Oh, doctor, in my garden. How could this happen? Why here?" Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "Perhaps we should help the Reverend back to the house, doctor. A cup of strong tea, I think, is in order. Shock can be insidious." Her tone was soothing, practical. "An excellent idea, Miss Marple," Haydock agreed gratefully. "Come along, Caleb, lean on me." As they guided the stunned vicar back towards the house, Miss Marple cast one last lingering glance over her shoulder. Her eyes swept past the huddled figure of Dr. Haydock, bending once more over the body, past the constable, now unspooling police tape, and fixed, again, on that patch of disturbed earth near the rose bush. The footprint. And then her gaze drifted upwards to the peace rose itself. Amongst the flawless pale yellow blooms, one stem showed a slight break near the top, a single thorn visibly bent and scraped, as if brushed with considerable force. A tiny detail, perhaps, meaningless, but coupled with the footprint, the untouched watch, the specific wound, it formed the first fragile thread of a pattern only she, with her lifetime of observing the minutiae of human nature, had begun to discern. Inside the vicarage study, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken horror. Haydock administered a mild sedative to the trembling vicar. Miss Marple efficiently brewed a pot of strong, reviving tea, her movements calm and methodical, a small anchor in the storm of Binnings' distress. "Mr. Finch," Binnings began, his voice weak but steadier with the tea and the doctor's ministrations, "seemed pleasant enough, kept to himself mostly at the Grange, but he did ask some Unusual questions. Unusual how? Ms. Marple prompted gently, handing him a cup. About the old families, specifically the Fortescues. He knew Sir George Fortescue had died suddenly last year, leaving everything to his young second wife. He asked about the circumstances, seemed very interested in the will, in who inherited what, and he asked about accidents, historical accidents in the village, falls, drownings, that sort of thing. Bennings shuddered. I thought it was just morbid curiosity for his book, but now? Falls? Drownings? Ms. Marple echoed softly, her needles, she had produced them instinctively from her bag, beginning a soft, rhythmic click. And the Fortescues? A young widow inheriting. That can sometimes cause friction, can it not? In families, in villages. Bennings nodded miserably. There was talk. Sir George's son by his first marriage, Edward, was displeased, thought the second wife, Isabel, had influenced his father. There was quite a scene at the reading of the will, I heard. But Edward lives in London mostly. Isabel is still at the Manor House. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening intently, interjected, so Finch was digging into local scandals, asking about wills and unexpected deaths. That sounds less like historical research and more like investigation. Was he looking into something specific? Sir George's death, perhaps? Sir George's death was ruled a heart attack, Doctor. He was found at the bottom of the main staircase at the Manor House. Very sad. But Finch, he asked if there had been any other unexpected deaths recently, connected to the family or the village. The vicar looked bewildered. I didn't think much of it at the time. Now, it seems sinister. Outside, the sound of an arriving car, more authoritative than the doctor's, announced the arrival of Inspector Davies from the county police in Milchester. A tall, brusque man with a mustache that seemed to bristle with impatience soon strode into the study, nodding curtly to Haydock and Bennings, barely acknowledging Miss Marple. Right, Reverend? Doctor? Terrible business. Peters has filled me in partially. Let's have a look at this scene. His tone was efficient, devoid of the gentleness Haydock had shown. He turned to leave. Miss Marple, however, spoke up, her voice soft but clear in the sudden silence. Inspector Davies, a moment, if I may. Davies paused, turning back, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Yes, Miss Marple, I'm afraid this isn't really a matter for— Oh, I quite understand, Inspector, she said calmly, her needles clicking softly, but I was present when the body was discovered, and I couldn't help but notice something rather curious near the rose bush where poor Mr. Finch was found. Davies raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what was that? It was a footprint, partial, but quite distinct, in the soft earth just off the gravel path behind the peace rose. It appeared to be made by a woman's shoe, a small shoe, I would say. She delivered the information factually, as if commenting on the weather.
Davies stared at her for a moment, then snorted. A footprint? In a garden? Miss Marple, gardens are full of footprints. Gardeners, visitors, the vicar himself. It means nothing, probably days old. He waved a dismissive hand. We're looking for a weapon, for signs of a struggle, for motives, not muddy footprints. But, Inspector, Miss Marple persisted gently, the soil there is particularly soft and damp, recently turned. This impression looked fresh, and it was facing the bush, towards where Mr. Finch lay. And his watch, Inspector, it was untouched. His wallet, full. Surely that argues against a common robber. Davies' expression hardened slightly. Leave the detecting to the professionals, Miss Marple, if you please. We'll examine the scene thoroughly. Footprints, valuables, all will be taken into account. Now,
if you'll excuse me." He turned on his heel and marched out of the room, leaving the scent of impatience behind him. Dr. Haydock sighed, shooting Miss Marple an apologetic look. "He's a good man, Miss Marple, thorough in his own way, but he likes clear facts, obvious motives. Footprints and untouched watches don't fit his usual pattern." Miss Marple gave a small, understanding nod, her eyes twinkling with a familiar, quiet amusement. Men like Inspector Davies often overlook the significance of small things, Doctor. They look for the loud noise, not the whisper that precedes it. But the whisper, she added, her gaze drifting towards the window and the garden beyond, is often where the truth begins. She took a sip of her tea, now cool. The whisper, and a woman's footprint in the earth. She set her cup down with a decisive little click. The vicarage garden, once a symbol of peace, now held a dark secret. The police would search for a killer with a weapon, a motive written large. But Miss Marple, her mind already weaving the tiny threads she'd gathered, the specific wound, the untouched valuables, the vicar's tale of Finch's probing questions, the young widow inheriting, the disgruntled son, and that telltale, overlooked footprint, knew the truth would likely be found in the nuances, the quiet deviations from the expected. The killer hadn't just struck with a sharp object. They had stepped off the path, leaving behind a faint, fragile impression. And Miss Marple, with a lifetime of understanding the devious twists of human nature hidden beneath placid surfaces, had every intention of following where that footprint led. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think, Doctor, I shall take my leave. The Reverend needs rest. And I find I have a sudden urge to check on my own roses. One never knows what one might find hidden amongst the petals." She gave a small, enigmatic smile and walked out, leaving the vicarage to the official investigation, her mind already quietly turning over the puzzle of Alistair Finch, murdered with a smile and a teacup's distance from the vicar's own back door. The game, as she saw it, had most certainly begun.
Chapter 2. Tea and Treacherous Tongues. The discovery of Alistair Finch's body had cast a long, unsettling shadow over St. Mary Mead. The usual hum of village life, the clatter of the milk float, the cheerful greetings over garden fences seemed subdued, replaced by hushed conversations that fell silent whenever anyone unfamiliar approached. Miss Marple, however, moved through this atmosphere of brittle calm with her customary serenity. Her morning walk took her past the vicarage, now cordoned off with stark yellow police tape that fluttered like a mournful flag in the gentle breeze. Inspector Davies' car was still parked outside, a testament to the official investigation grinding on. She knew, with the certainty born of long experience, that the inspector's methods would be thorough, but linear. He would question the obvious suspects, search for the weapon, check alibis. He would overlook the whispers, the nuances, the subtle shifts in behavior that spoke louder than any shouted confession. To uncover the truth behind that precise, brutal wound and the woman's footprint in the soft earth, she needed to tap into the village's lifeblood, gossip. And the most potent source of that, currently, was undoubtedly the vicar's wife, Esther Binnings. Esther had returned from Cheltenham the previous evening, walking into a nightmare. Miss Marple judged it would be both kind and strategically sound to pay a condolence call. Armed with a small bunch of sweet peas from her garden and a tin of her own special shortbread biscuits, she presented herself at the vicarage side door around 11 o'clock, mindful that the police might still be occupying the main rooms. Esther Binnings received her in the cozy, book-lined drawing room at the back of the house, mercifully overlooking the garden rather than the scene of the crime. The vicar's wife, usually a model of composed efficiency, looked pale and strained, dark circles smudged beneath her kind eyes.
She gestured Miss Marple to a comfortable armchair upholstered in faded chintz. "Miss Marple, how kind of you. Do come in. Forgive the state of things. It's all quite dreadful." Her voice trembled slightly. "Caleb is with Inspector Davies now. They're going over the garden again. I can't bear to look." "Perfectly understandable, my dear," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, placing the flowers and biscuits on a nearby table. "Such a terrible shock, and for you to return to it, well, one can only imagine." She settled into the chair, her gaze taking in the room, the neat stacks of parish magazines, the half-finished piece of embroidery on a stand, the slight tremor in Esther's hand as she reached for the teapot. "A cup of tea would be most welcome, if it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Esther said, grateful for the mundane task. She poured the fragrant, steaming brew into delicate china cups. "Milk? Sugar?" "Just a splash of milk, thank you, Esther." As Esther handed her the cup, her composure wavered. "Oh, Miss Marple, why? Why here, in our peaceful garden? And poor Mr. Finch, he seemed such a quiet, inoffensive man. What could anyone possibly want with him?" She sank into her own chair, cradling her cup like a lifeline. "That," Miss Marple said gently, stirring her tea, "is the question, isn't it? The why. Inspector Davies seems focused on the how and who, but the why is often the key." She took a delicate sip. "Caleb mentioned yesterday that Mr. Finch was asking some rather unusual questions about local history, about families." Esther nodded vigorously, her eyes widening slightly. "Oh, yes, Caleb told me. He was quite preoccupied with it. He mentioned Finch asking about the Fortescues specifically, about Sir George's death and young Edward's reaction to the will, and he asked Caleb if there had been any other unexpected deaths recently connected to the village." He lowered her voice conspiratorially. "It sounded so morbid at the time. Now," she shuddered. "Unexpected deaths," Miss Marple prompted, her knitting needles appearing in her lap as if by magic, their soft click-click a soothing counterpoint to the tension. "That is rather specific. Did Caleb say what Finch meant by that?" "Not really, just that Finch seemed very interested in accidents, falls, that sort of thing. Caleb thought he might be researching some local tragedy for his book. But," Esther leaned forward, her expression troubled, "there was something else, something Caleb found odd. Finch asked about Dr. Haydock." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "Dr. Haydock? Our dear Dr. Haydock? Whatever for?" "Finch wanted to know how long he'd been the village doctor, if he was well respected, if there had ever been any questions about his diagnoses, particularly regarding older patients." Esther looked bewildered. "Caleb said it felt almost accusatory, as if Finch suspected the doctor of something dreadful, but that's absurd. Dr. Haydock has cared for this village for 30 years. He delivered half the people here." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, resuming her knitting. "A most peculiar line of inquiry. One wonders what could have prompted it." She let the silence hang for a moment, allowing Esther to absorb the implication. "And the Fortescues? Young Edward must have been quite upset about the will." "Upset?" Esther gave a short, bitter laugh. "He was furious, made a dreadful scene at the solicitor's office, so I heard, accused Isabel of all sorts of impropriety, said she'd bewitched his father, coerced him into changing the will. Sir George left her everything, the manor house, the investments, even his mother's jewels. Edward got only a modest trust fund he can't touch until he's 40. He's not a thrifty man, Edward. Lives beyond his means in London. The money from the trust would barely cover his gambling debts, let alone his lifestyle." "Gambling debts," Miss Marple echoed softly. "That does add a certain urgency to his financial plight, doesn't it?" "Exactly," Esther nodded. "And he was here in St. Mary Mead just last week. Had a blazing row with Isabel at the manor house, apparently. Shouting, threats. The staff were quite alarmed. Then he stormed off, and now Mr. Finch turns up dead, asking questions about the Fortescues." She trailed off, the implication hanging heavily in the air. "And Isabel Fortescue herself?" Miss Marple asked, her tone neutral. "How has she taken this? The murder, I mean, and the renewed focus on her inheritance?" Esther sighed. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. She came to see Caleb yesterday morning, before Finch was found. She seemed quite composed. Too composed, some might say. But then Isabel is always composed. Cool as a cucumber, that one. Beautiful, charming, and sharp as a tack. She asked Caleb if he'd heard anything more about Finch's research. Said she found it unsettling, that he'd been asking her questions, too." "Questions?" Miss Marple's needles paused again. "What kind of questions?" "About Sir George's final days, about his habits, about his medication." Esther lowered her voice even further. "Isabel said Finch seemed particularly interested in whether Sir George had ever complained of dizziness or palpitations before his heart attack, implying it might not have been natural." Esther was scandalized. "Can you imagine? As if Isabel would— No, it's unthinkable." "Is it?" Miss Marple murmured almost to herself. "A young wife, inheriting everything, a disgruntled son with financial troubles, a doctor whose competence is questioned, and a man digging into it all, found murdered with a weapon that suggests precision."
Perhaps even medical knowledge. She looked directly at Esther. "It does create a rather tangled web, doesn't it?" Esther paled. "Oh dear, when you put it like that. But surely not Dr. Haydock. And Isabel, she's so elegant, so refined. And Edward, well, he's a hothead, but murder? In cold blood? With an ice pick?" She shuddered. "One never knows what people are capable of under pressure, Esther, especially when secrets are threatened." She took another sip of tea, her gaze drifting towards the window, though the view of the garden was obscured by the drawn curtains. "This Mr. Finch, he was staying at the Grange," Caleb said. "Has anyone spoken to his landlady, Mrs. Gubbins? She sees everything, that woman." Esther nodded. Caleb mentioned Inspector Davies had spoken to her. She said Finch was very quiet, kept to himself, spent most evenings in his room, writing. But she did mention one thing. A visitor. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A visitor? Yes, late one afternoon, just before he died. A woman. Mrs. Gubbins didn't see her face clearly. She had a large hat and a veil, but she heard Finch call her "my dear." They spoke for about 20 minutes in Finch's sitting room. Mrs. Gubbins said Finch sounded agitated, raised his voice once. The woman left looking upset, she thought, flustered. "My dear," Miss Marple repeated softly, the words hanging in the air. "That suggests a certain intimacy, familiarity, not a casual acquaintance." She considered the possibilities. Edward Fortescue was unlikely to be called "my dear." Dr. Haydock, even less so. Isabel Fortescue. It was plausible. She was young, attractive, and Finch was clearly investigating her. "My dear" could be sarcastic, or perhaps something more complex. But who else? Who else in the village might Finch have been on such familiar terms with, especially a woman who might be agitated by his questions? Did Mrs. Gubbins say anything else? Height, build,
Anything distinctive about the woman's voice? Miss Marple pressed. Only that she was well dressed, expensive coat, she thought, and her voice, Mrs. Gubbins said it was cultured, soft-spoken, even when Finch raised his voice. She sounded distressed. Esther sighed. It's not much to go on, is it? It's more than we had before, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. A well-dressed woman, with a cultured voice, called "my dear" by the victim, who left him agitated shortly before his death. It adds another layer to the mystery. She finished her tea and set the cup down with a decisive little click. Well, Esther, I shouldn't tire you further with my speculations. You need your rest. This has been most illuminating, though. Most illuminating indeed. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, Esther touched her arm. Miss Marple, do you really think it could be someone here? Someone we know? Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression a mixture of sympathy and profound understanding. Human nature is a complex tapestry, my dear. The brightest threads often run closest to the darkest shadows. But trust in this, the truth, however uncomfortable, has a way of surfacing, especially, she added, her eyes holding a sudden, unnerving clarity, when someone knows where to look for the loose threads. She gave Esther a final reassuring squeeze. Rest now, and try not to worry. Caleb will need your strength. Miss Marple let herself out of the vicarage, the scent of sweet peas and the lingering taste of tea accompanying her. The morning sun was higher now, burning off the last of the dew. The police tape fluttered, a stark reminder of the violence hidden beneath the village's placid surface. She walked slowly, digesting the information Esther had provided. Edward Fortescue, motive, financial desperation, opportunity, he was in the village recently, temperament, violent. Isabel Fortescue, motive, inheritance, potential secrets about Sir George's death, opportunity, she was in the village, temperament, cool, controlled, potentially ruthless. Dr. Haydock, motive, professional reputation threatened by Finch's insinuations, opportunity, medical knowledge could explain the precise wound, temperament, usually calm, but pride could be a powerful driver. And now the mysterious visitor, a woman, well-dressed, cultured voice, familiar enough to be called "my dear," leaving him agitated shortly before his death. The footprint in the garden suddenly took on new significance. A woman's footprint. Could it belong to this visitor, to Isabel, or to someone entirely else, someone Esther hadn't mentioned, someone whose connection to Finch was even hidden? Miss Marple paused by the village green, watching a group of children playing, their shrieks of laughter a stark contrast to the grim thoughts occupying her mind. She needed to think differently. Finch wasn't just asking questions, he was digging into the Fortescue's inheritance, into Sir George's death, into Dr. Haydock's record. Why? What was he really looking for? And who stood to lose the most if he found it? The answer, she suspected, lay not just in the obvious motives, but in the relationships, the hidden connections, the secrets people thought were long buried. The visitor called "my dear" was the key. Who was she? And what did Finch say or discover that had so agitated her? As she turned towards her own cottage, a fragment of overheard conversation from the previous Sunday drifted back to her. She'd been leaving church when she'd passed two women near the Lich Gate. One had been saying, "And she was always so devoted to him, even after, well, you know, it's touching really." The other had replied, "Devoted or calculating? One wonders what she'll do now he's gone." At the time, Miss Marple had assumed they were discussing some recent bereavement in the village. Now, in the chilling light of Alistair Finch's murder, the words took on a sinister new meaning. Devoted or calculating?
One wonders what she'll do now he's gone. Who was she, and who was him? Finch, or someone entirely else? The pieces were swirling, refusing to settle, but one thing was clear-cut. The person Finch had called "my dear," the woman who visited him at the Grange and left him disturbed, was not just a potential witness. She was, very likely, the key to the entire puzzle. And Miss Marple had a strong, unsettling suspicion about who that dear friend might be. Someone everyone in St. Mary Mead trusted implicitly. Someone whose potential motive for silencing Alistair Finch was far more personal and far more dangerous than anyone yet suspected. She reached her gate, the familiar comfort of her small garden a welcome sight, but her mind was far from peaceful. The teacups were cleared, the gossip shared, but the treacherous tongues had revealed a labyrinth of secrets and lies. Miss Marple knew she needed to tread carefully. The next thread she pulled might just unravel the whole tapestry, or it might just tighten the noose around an innocent neck. The game was afoot, and the stakes were higher than a simple cup of tea.
Chapter 3. The Poisoned Pen Pal. The morning after her illuminating tea with Esther Binnings dawned grey and damp, a fine mist clinging to the rooftops of St. Mary Mead like a shroud. The village seemed to hold its breath, the usual bustle muted by the lingering shock of Alistair Finch's murder. Miss Marple, however, found the weather curiously fitting. It mirrored the murkiness surrounding the case, the hidden motives, the veiled visitor, the unsettling questions about Dr. Haydock. Inspector Davies was still conducting his official interviews, likely focusing on Edward Fortescue's temper and Isabel's inheritance, but Miss Marple knew the path to the truth lay elsewhere. It lay in the private papers of the dead man, in the secrets he'd uncovered and the enemies he'd made. And the most likely place to find those was the Grange, the boarding house where Finch had spent his final weeks. Mrs. Gubbins, the Grange's formidable landlady, was a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose tongue wagged with equal speed. Miss Marple judged a visit was overdue. Armed with a pot of her homemade raspberry jam, a universally accepted currency in St. Mary Mead, she presented herself at the Grange's imposing front door around mid-morning. Mrs. Gubbins, a stout woman in a perpetual floral apron, received her in the cramped, cluttered front parlour. The air smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and furniture polish. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure! Though pleasure hardly seems the word these dreadful days, does it? Come in, come in. Mind the cat." She gestured to a tabby dozing on a worn armchair. "Thank you, Mrs. Gubbins," Miss Marple said warmly, placing the jam-pot on a crowded side table. "I thought you might appreciate a little something. These times are trying for everyone, especially those closest to the events." Mrs. Gubbins nodded vigorously, her chins wobbling. "Too right, Miss Marple, too right. That Inspector Davies has been here twice, asking questions, poking around poor Mr. Finch's room, as if I would know anything. Though," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, leaning forward, "I did tell him about the visitor, the veiled lady." "Yes, Esther Binnings mentioned that," Miss Marple said smoothly, settling into a chair that groaned in protest. "Most unsettling. Did you happen to notice anything else? Anything at all that seemed unusual about Mr. Finch's habits or belongings before the end?" Mrs. Gubbins pursed her lips, thinking. Unusual? He was a quiet one, kept himself to himself, spent hours in his room scribbling away in that notebook of his. But, she hesitated, tapping a plump finger against her chin, there was one thing. After the police had finished their first search, looking for weapons and such, I went in to tidy properly. Found something tucked down the side of his writing desk. Must have slipped down there, missed by the inspector's men. Miss Marple's interest sharpened instantly, though her expression remained placid.
"Oh, what was that?" "A bundle of letters, Miss Marple, tied up with a bit of twine. Looked old. I nearly threw them out, thinking they were just research notes or something, but then I saw the top one. The handwriting. It gave me a turn." "The handwriting?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "It was very familiar, very familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but then it came to me. I've seen it before, often." She looked at Miss Marple with her eyes wide with significance. "On prescriptions, Dr. Haydock's prescriptions. The same distinctive loop on the G's, and the way he crosses his T's with a little flourish to the right. It's unmistakable." Miss Marple felt a frisson of excitement, cold and sharp. "Dr. Haydock's handwriting on letters found hidden in Finch's room." This was the connection she'd sensed, the loose thread Esther had inadvertently revealed. "You still have these letters, Miss Marple?" "Oh, yes, Miss Marple." Mrs. Gubbins bustled over to a small mahogany desk against the wall, rummaged in a drawer, and produced a small, slightly dusty bundle tied with faded blue twine. "Here they are. I didn't know what to do with them. Didn't want to bother the inspector again. He gets so tetchy. Thought perhaps, well, you have a way of seeing things, Miss Marple, a way of understanding." Miss Marple accepted the bundle with hands that, to her credit, remained steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Gubbins. This could be very important indeed. May I? Just for a moment." Of course. Take your time. I'll just pop and put the kettle on. A cup of tea is always in order, isn't it? Especially when discussing, well, mysteries." Mrs. Gubbins bustled out of the room, leaving Miss Marple alone with the letters. With deliberate care, Miss Marple untied the twine. The bundle contained 6 letters, all written on the same expensive, heavy cream notepaper. The handwriting was distinctive, neat, precise, with the looping G's and the right flourishing T's Mrs. Gubbins had noted. It was undeniably Dr. Haydock's, but the content was something else entirely. The first letter was dated several months prior to Finch's arrival in St. Mary Mead. It began, "Dear Mr. Finch, your recent inquiries into the mortality statistics of St. Mary Mead, particularly concerning patients under my care over the past decade, have come to my attention. While I appreciate your dedication to historical accuracy, I must urge the utmost discretion. Certain cases, while officially recorded as natural causes, involved complexities. Family sensitivities are paramount. A generous donation to the Village Hall Restoration Fund would demonstrate your understanding of the need for confidentiality in these matters." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. It wasn't quite a direct threat, but it was unmistakably blackmail. The mention of complexities and family sensitivities was code, and the demand for a donation was a crude shakedown. She quickly scanned the subsequent letters. Each one followed a similar pattern. Finch's probing questions had clearly uncovered something specific about one of Haydock's cases, likely Sir George Fortescue's heart attack, and Haydock was demanding money, escalating the amounts to keep it quiet. The last letter, dated only a week before Finch's death, was far more menacing. "Mr. Finch, your persistence is noted. Your proposed article will not see publication. The consequences of your failure to comprehend the gravity of this situation would be most unfortunate for your health and potentially for your continued residence in St. Mary Mead. Deliver the enclosed sum to the usual location by Friday. No further warnings will be given."
Miss Marple's blood ran cold. This was no longer subtle pressure. It was a clear threat of violence. And Finch had been murdered days later. The motive for Haydock was starkly apparent. Finch was about to expose him, likely for malpractice or even manslaughter, in the death of Sir George Fortescue. Haydock, using his position and knowledge, had tried to buy silence. When that failed, he'd resorted to permanent silence. But there was more.
Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a tiny detail on the last letter. Near the bottom, where Haydock had signed his name with a flourish, there was a small, almost imperceptible smudge of ink. Not a careless blot, but a deliberate small mark, like a tiny comma or a distorted letter. It looked out of place. She held the letter up to the light, filtering through the grimy window. The smudge seemed to overlay part of the flourish. It was an addition, made after the signature. What did it signify? A secret mark? A code? Or simply a slip of the pen? She carefully refolded the letters and retied the twine, her mind racing. The evidence against Haydock was mounting. The specific wound that suggested medical knowledge, Finch's questions about his competence, and now these damning letters proving blackmail and a direct threat. But something nagged at her. The footprint, the veiled woman, the phrase, "my dear." Haydock was a man. Could he have disguised himself? Unlikely. And why the elaborate subterfuge? And the letters, while proving motive, didn't necessarily prove he committed the murder himself. He could have hired someone. But who? And why the woman's footprint? Mrs. Gubbins returned with a steaming teapot and 2 cups. "Find anything interesting, Miss Marple?" "Indeed, Mrs. Gubbins," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Very interesting, and potentially very important. I believe Inspector Davies needs to see these immediately." "Oh, dear, the inspector! He'll be cross I held them back." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple reassured her. "You acted perfectly sensibly. You recognized the significance and brought them to someone who could understand their context. That shows commendable presence of mind. Now, I shall take them to him. You've been most helpful." Miss Marple left the Grange, the bundle of letters feeling heavy in her hand, a tangible weight of guilt and malice. She walked not towards the vicarage, where Davies was likely still ensconced, but towards the village constabulary, a small brick building next to the post office. She found Constable Peters attempting to mend a wobbly chair leg. "Ah, Constable Peters," Miss Marple said brightly. "Busy as ever, I see. Might I have a word? It's rather urgent." Peters looked up, relief washing over his face at the distraction. "Miss Marple, of course. What can I do for you? Is it about about Mr. Finch?" "It is indeed, Constable. I've come into possession of some documents that I believe Inspector Davies should examine without delay. They were found in Mr. Finch's room at the Grange, overlooked during the initial search." She handed them. Peters took it, his eyes widening as he saw the handwriting on the top letter. "Good gracious! Is that... "I believe it is, Dr. Haydock's, and I strongly advise you to read them carefully before passing them to the inspector. They shed a different light on certain aspects of the case." She fixed him with a gaze that was both kind and commanding. "Particularly the last one." Peters, sensing the gravity, nodded solemnly. "Right you are, Miss Marple. I'll read them straight away, and then I'll take them directly to the inspector, wherever he is." "Thank you, Constable. I knew I could rely on your discretion." She gave him a small, encouraging smile and left him to his grim task. She didn't wait to see Davies' reaction. She knew the letters would cause a seismic shift in the investigation. Haydock would be brought in for questioning, his alibi scrutinized, his surgery searched.
But Miss Marple's mind was already moving beyond Haydock. The letters proved the motive, but they didn't explain the method entirely, nor the conflicting evidence of the woman's footprint and the veiled visitor. And that tiny ink smudge, what did it mean? Was it Haydock's mark or someone else's? As she walked past the village green, she saw Dr. Haydock's car parked outside his surgery. A wave of cold fury washed over her. A man trusted to heal, using his knowledge to threaten and kill. But she forced herself to remain analytical. Haydock was arrogant, but was he foolish enough to leave such incriminating letters lying around? Or had he wanted them found? Found after Finch was dead to point the finger squarely at him? It seemed absurdly risky. Unless Haydock wasn't the killer. Unless he was being framed. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. Who else knew about Finch's investigation? Who else had access to Haydock's prescription pad to forge the letters? Who else stood to benefit if Haydock took the fall? Isabel Fortescue? Edward? The veiled woman? The ink smudge, was it a flaw in the forgery, or a deliberate clue left by the real killer? Miss Marple stopped by the war memorial, her mind reeling. The puzzle had just become infinitely more complex. The letters seemed to damn Haydock, but they also raised terrifying new possibilities. If Haydock was innocent, then the real killer was not only a murderer, but also a cunning forger, willing to sacrifice an innocent man, even a blackmailer, to cover their own tracks. And that killer was still at large, potentially watching the chaos unfold. She needed to test her theory. She needed to observe Haydock when he learned the letters had been found. Would he act like a trapped man, or like an innocent man framed? And she needed to find out who else could have forged those letters. Who else had the opportunity, the skill, and the motive? Her gaze drifted towards the manor house, visible on the hill beyond the village. Isabel Fortescue, young, beautiful, seemingly composed, she had motive, protecting her inheritance and potentially her own secrets if Sir George's death was not natural. She had opportunity, she was in the village, and she had access. Haydock was her doctor. She could easily have seen his handwriting, even obtained a prescription pad. Could the cultured voice Mrs. Gubbins heard belong to Isabel? Could she have been the veiled woman, visiting Finch under false pretenses, perhaps even trying to warn him or to threaten him herself? And could she have forged the letters to divert suspicion onto Haydock? It was a chilling possibility. Isabel calling Finch, "my dear"? It could be affectionate, or it could be laced with irony, even menace. And the footprint, a woman's footprint near the scene. Isabel was certainly capable of stepping off a path. Miss Marple's decision crystallized. She needed to speak with Isabel Fortescue. Not as an accuser, but as a concerned villager, a harmless old lady offering condolences. She needed to see Isabel's reaction when the news of Haydock's potential involvement broke. She needed to observe her, to listen to the nuances in her voice, to watch her eyes. For in the delicate dance of deception, the eyes often betrayed what the tongue concealed. She turned away from the green and began the walk up the lane towards the manor house. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the imposing Georgian facade of the Fortescue home. It looked grand, slightly forbidding, a monument to wealth and the secrets it could buy. As she walked, Miss Marple's mind worked with the relentless precision of clockwork. The blackmail letters were a bombshell, but they might also be a smokescreen. The real poison, she suspected, wasn't just in the ink on the page. It was in the heart of the person who had penned them or forged them, and then wielded a much sharper, more deadly weapon to silence Alistair Finch.
Permanently. The game had shifted, and the stakes had become terrifyingly personal. She needed to tread carefully, for the next move could be fatal.
Chapter 4. A Pattern in the Petunias. The news of Dr. Haydock's implication in Alistair Finch's murder swept through St. Mary Mead like a wildfire, leaving smoldering whispers in its wake. Constable Peters, flushed with the importance of his discovery, had delivered the blackmail letters to a stunned Inspector Davies. The result was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Haydock's surgery was sealed, his movements restricted, and the official focus of the investigation shifted entirely onto the village's trusted physician. Yet, amidst the shock and speculation, life, as it stubbornly does in the English countryside, continued. And nowhere was this more evident than at the manor house, where Isabel Fortescue, in a display of either remarkable composure or breathtaking audacity, was hosting her annual summer garden party. Miss Marple received her invitation, a cream-colored card edged with gold leaf, with a sense of grim determination. It was, she knew, the perfect arena to observe the key players under pressure. Edward Fortescue, arriving from London that morning, would surely be present, seething over his lost inheritance, and now potentially implicated through his connection to Finch's inquiries. Isabel herself would be the center of attention, her every gesture scrutinized. And while Dr. Haydock was under police guard, the shadow of his alleged guilt would hang heavy over the proceedings, coloring every conversation. It was an opportunity too valuable to miss. She chose her attire with care, a dress of soft lavender linen, practical yet respectful of the occasion, a wide-brimmed straw hat adorned with silk violets, and her ever-present knitting bag. She arrived fashionably late, allowing the initial flurry of arrivals to subside. The manor house gardens were in their full, riotous glory. Herbaceous borders blazed with color, delphiniums like spires of blue smoke, lupins standing tall in shades of pink and yellow, and everywhere roses. The air was thick with their scent, mingled with the tang of freshly cut grass and the fainter, more exotic perfume of lilies blooming in urns near the terrace. White-jacketed waiters circulated with trays of champagne and delicate canapes. A string quartet played Mozart from a discreet corner of the lawn, the music a fragile counterpoint to the undercurrents of tension. Miss Marple accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing waiter and found a quiet seat on a wrought-iron bench near a bed of vibrant pink petunias. From here, she had an excellent view of the terrace and the main gathering. Isabel Fortescue was the undisputed queen of her domain. Dressed in a flowing gown of emerald green silk that set off her dark hair and pale complexion, she moved through the crowd with effortless grace, a picture of serene elegance. She smiled, she chatted, she introduced guests, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the minute details, the slight tension around her mouth that didn't reach her eyes, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her champagne flute when certain topics were broached, the flicker of something cold and watchful in her gaze when it swept the assembled company. She was performing, and performing brilliantly, but the performance was under strain. Edward Fortescue, meanwhile, was a study in barely contained fury. He stood apart from the main group, nursing a whiskey glass, his expensive suit looking rumpled, his face flushed. He glowered at his stepmother, his knuckles white where he gripped his glass. When approached by well-meaning acquaintances offering condolences on his father's death and the current scandal, his responses were curt, bordering on rude. He radiated an aura of frustrated entitlement and simmering violence. Miss Marple observed him carefully,
He had motive, intense financial pressure, hatred for Isabel. He had opportunity. He'd been in the village recently. But did he have the means? The precise wound suggested knowledge, skill. Edward seemed more the type to lash out physically, not plan a cold-blooded assassination with an ice pick. Still, desperation could breed cunning. Her attention was drawn to a small group near the rose garden. Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance. Appalling, simply appalling, Dr. Haydock, of all people, to think we trusted him with our lives. And poor Mr. Finch, murdered in cold blood. It's the talk of the county, I assure you. They say he was blackmailing the doctor over Sir George's death. Imagine poisoning his own patient, or worse. She shuddered dramatically. A nervous-looking man beside her, Mr. Petherick, the solicitor who had handled Sir George's will, shifted uncomfortably. Now, Amelia, we mustn't jump to conclusions. The inspector is merely questioning him. There's no proof yet." "Proof?" Mrs. Price Ridley scoffed. "Those letters, found in Finch's room. It's damning, Petherick, damning. And that wound so precise. Who else but a doctor could do that? Mark my words, Haydock's our killer. And Isabel must have known something. Why else would Finch be asking about her?" Miss Marple noted Petherick's discomfort. As the solicitor, he knew the intimate details of the Fortescue finances and Sir George's medical history. Did he know more than he was letting on? Had Finch approached him too? As if sensing her gaze, Petherick looked over and gave a strained smile. Miss Marple responded with a gentle nod, her expression unreadable. She watched him extricate himself from Mrs. Price Ridley and make a beeline for Isabel. They spoke briefly, heads close together. Isabel listened intently, her serene mask slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of what? Fear? Annoyance? Calculation? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a calm nod as Petherick moved away.
Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to Edward. He was now engaged in a heated, low-voiced conversation with a younger man she recognized as a business associate from London. Edward was gesticulating angrily, jabbing a finger towards Isabel. The associate looked alarmed, trying to calm him. Suddenly, Edward's voice rose, cutting through the music and chatter. "Her. It's always about her. That gold-digging witch stole everything, and now she's playing the grieving widow while her pet doctor takes the fall? Don't be a fool, Charles. She's behind this. She had Finch killed because he was getting too close. And Haydock? He's just her patsy." A shocked silence fell over the nearest guests. Isabel turned, her face a mask of icy composure, though Miss Marple saw the pulse fluttering rapidly in her throat. She glided towards Edward, her movements smooth and controlled. "Edward," she said, her voice carrying clearly, yet devoid of any heat. "This is neither the time nor the place. You're upsetting our guests. Control yourself." "Upsetting guests," Edward spat, his face purple with rage. "What about the fact you murdered my father? What about that, Isabel? Finch knew. He was going to prove it, and you silenced him, just like you silenced George." The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and stark. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Inspector Davies, who had arrived discreetly to observe, stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "Mr. Fortescue, that is a very serious allegation. I suggest you retract it immediately and accompany me to discuss these theories elsewhere." Edward seemed to deflate slightly, the reality of his public outburst crashing down on him. He glared at Isabel, then at Davies, and with a final guttural sound of frustration, shoved his way through the crowd and stormed off towards the house, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. Isabel turned to the assembled guests, a picture of wounded dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize profoundly for my stepson's
distress. He is understandably overcome by grief and the terrible events surrounding us. Please do not let this unfortunate incident spoil your enjoyment of the garden." She signaled the quartet, who hesitantly resumed playing. Slowly, hesitantly, conversations began again, though the mood was irrevocably altered, charged with suspicion and fear. Miss Marple watched Isabel closely. The young widow handled the crisis with remarkable aplomb, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hand as she raised her glass to her lips, the way her eyes darted around the crowd, assessing reactions. She was shaken, but she was also thinking, calculating. This was the moment Miss Marple had been waiting for. She needed to gauge Isabel's reaction when the topic of Sir George's death and Haydock's alleged involvement was raised directly, but subtly. She rose from her bench and, as if drawn by the commotion, drifted towards Isabel, who was now speaking soothingly to a flustered Mrs. Price Ridley. "Quite unforgivable, Isabel, simply unforgivable. To accuse you like that, in public, after all you've been through." Mrs. Price Ridley was fluttering like a trapped bird. "One must make allowances for grief," Isabel said smoothly, "though Edward's passion is misplaced." Miss Marple seized the opening. "It is a terrible strain on everyone, Mrs. Fortescue," she said, her voice gentle and sympathetic. "This dreadful business with Mr. Finch, and now the shocking suggestion about Dr. Haydock. It must bring back painful memories of Sir George's passing. Such a sudden, unexpected tragedy." Isabel's eyes locked onto Miss Marple's. For a fleeting instant the polished facade cracked, revealing a depth of cold calculation that took Miss Marple's breath away. It was gone in a blink, replaced with weary sadness. "Indeed, Miss Marple," Isabel sighed, her voice thick with manufactured emotion, "Caleb was kind enough to mention Mr. Finch's morbid curiosity about George's heart attack. It was distressing, as if the poor man hadn't suffered enough. And now to think Dr. Haydock, the man who cared for George so diligently, might be implicated in another death. It's almost too much to bear." She looked away, dabbing delicately at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, "another death." It subtly reinforced Haydock's guilt without directly accusing him. And the emphasis on Haydock's diligent care for George, was that genuine or a deliberate misdirection? Miss Marple also observed Isabel's hands. They were steady now, the earlier tremor gone, composure fully restored. But the momentary glimpse of that chilling intelligence had been revealing. This was not just a grieving widow, this was a woman playing a deep and dangerous game. "Dr. Haydock always seemed so dedicated," Miss Marple murmured, seemingly innocently, "though I suppose even the most trusted individuals can have complexities, as Mr. Finch apparently discovered." Isabel's gaze sharpened again, just for a second. "Mr. Finch seemed to determine to find complexities where none existed, Miss Marple. He caused a great deal of unnecessary pain with his questions." There was a warning in that tone, a subtle shutting down of the topic. "Of course," Miss Marple agreed meekly, "one shouldn't dwell on unpleasantness, especially in such lovely surroundings." She gestured towards the magnificent borders. "Your roses are quite spectacular this year, Mrs. Fortescue. The peace variety in particular seems to be thriving." Isabel seized the change of subject with relief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Yes, they are doing well. Though," she added, a faint frown creasing her brow, "I've noticed something rather odd near the back border, by the old tool shed. Some of the petunias there look quite poorly. Yellowing leaves, stunted growth, almost as if something's been leaching into the soil. I must have the gardener look at it." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "How unfortunate! Poor drainage, perhaps, or something more specific." "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It's only in that one spot. Very strange." She was distracted by another guest approaching with condolences. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple." As Isabel moved away, Miss Marple's mind was already working. The poorly petunias, near the old tool shed, a specific spot. It seemed insignificant, but in the context of the case, any anomaly was worth investigating, especially near the manor house where Sir George had died. She finished her lemonade and set the glass down. Casually, she began to stroll in the direction Isabel had indicated, away from the main party, towards the rear of the gardens, where the borders were less formal, and the old stone tool shed stood half hidden by overgrown lilacs.
The air was quieter here, the sounds of the party muffled. The petunias Isabel mentioned were indeed looking sickly. Their vibrant pink was faded, the leaves curling and yellowing at the edges. Miss Marple knelt down, her old knees protesting only slightly, and examined the soil. It looked dark, rich, but slightly off. There was no obvious mold or fungus. She leaned closer, her nose wrinkling. There was a faint, unpleasant odor beneath the scent of earth and flowers, something bitter, almost medicinal. Her gaze swept the surrounding area. The tool shed was locked, its padlock rusty. Weeds grew thick around its base, and then, tucked almost out of sight behind a clump of overgrown ferns, partially hidden by the sickly petunias, she saw it. A plant she recognized instantly, though it seemed wildly out of place in a formal English garden border. It stood about 2 feet tall, with dark green, glossy leaves, divided into lobes, and tall spikes of striking hooded flowers. The flowers were a deep, velvety purple-blue, unlike anything else nearby. Monkshood, Aconitum napellus, one of the most poisonous plants known to man. Every part of it, root, stem, leaf, flower, contained deadly aconitine. A tiny amount could cause paralysis and cardiac arrest within hours, mimicking a heart attack. Symptoms included tingling, burning sensations, nausea, and a sense of suffocation, symptoms disturbingly similar to those described in some historical accounts of sudden deaths Miss Marple had read about. Her blood ran cold. What was Monkshood doing here, hidden near the tool shed, poisoning the petunias? It wasn't a garden escapee, it was too deliberately placed, too well hidden. And its proximity to the manor house, to where Sir George had died, and now to the spot where Isabel had noticed the plants dying. A terrible, chilling possibility began to form in Miss Marple's mind. Sir George's heart attack, the specific, precise wound on Alistair Finch, could it have been made not by an ice pick, but by something thinner, sharper? A dart, perhaps, or a needle coated with a concentrated extract of aconitine. The effects would be terrifyingly swift, the victim collapsing almost instantly, the tiny puncture wound easily overlooked or mistaken for something else. It explained the lack of struggle, the untouched valuables. It explained the precision. And who had access to such a plant? Who had the knowledge to use it? A doctor? Haydock certainly knew its properties, but so might someone with an interest in botany or someone who had researched poisons. Someone like Isabel Fortescue, who just pointed out the very spot where the deadly plant grew? Had that been a deliberate, almost taunting clue, or a genuine, ignorant observation? Miss Marple carefully broke off a single, damaged leaf that had fallen near the base of the monkshood plant, wrapping it in a clean handkerchief from her bag. She needed to show this to Dr. Haydock, or rather to Inspector Davies, so Haydock could be formally asked about it. The leaf was tangible evidence that pointed towards poison, not just a sharp weapon.
evidence that potentially linked Sir George's death directly to Finch's murder through a common deadly method. She stood up, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction. The pattern was becoming clearer. The blackmail letters pointed to Haydock's motive. Edward's outburst revealed his hatred and potential involvement. But the monkshood whispered of a different kind of killer, one with patience, with botanical knowledge, with access to the manor house gardens, one who could administer poison with chilling precision, one who might have used Haydock's blackmail as a convenient smokescreen. Isabel Fortescue, the cool, elegant widow, the woman who controlled the manor house, its gardens, and its secrets, the woman who just directed Miss Marple's attention to the very spot where the evidence lay hidden. Miss Marple walked back towards the main lawn, the wrapped leaf a heavy weight in her pocket. The garden party continued, the music played, the guests chattered, oblivious to the deadly secret nestled amongst the petunias. Miss Marple knew she had found the crucial thread. The next step was to pull it and see what dark tapestry unraveled. The game was far from over, but the board had just become infinitely more dangerous. She needed to act, and act quickly, before the gardener looked at the sickly petunias and the deadly monkshood was conveniently removed.
Chapter 5. Crumbs of Evidence. The discovery of the monkshood plant, hidden like a malevolent secret amongst the sickly petunias at the manor house, had crystallized Miss Marple's suspicions. The link between Sir George's sudden heart attack and Alistair Finch's precise, fatal wound now shimmered with deadly clarity. Aconite. The poison explained the lack of struggle, the untouched valuables, and the chilling precision. It pointed towards a killer with botanical knowledge and access to both the manor house gardens and, potentially, Dr. Haydock's prescription pad. Isabel Fortescue remained the most compelling figure in that shadowy landscape, the elegant widow who controlled the scene of both crimes, who had inadvertently directed attention to the very spot where the evidence grew. But suspicion, however strong, was not proof. Miss Marple needed to observe Isabel in her own domain, away from the public performance of the garden party, to gauge her reactions, her habits, her knowledge. She needed a pretext that felt natural, unthreatening. The solution arrived the following morning with a note delivered by Mrs. Fortescue's maid, a polite, formal request for the return of a volume of local history Miss Marple had lent Sir George some months before his death. It was a perfect, almost too convenient opportunity. Miss Marple arrived at the manor house just before 11. The grand entrance hall was cool and hushed, the air redolent of beeswax polish and the faint, ghostly scent of lilies. A maid showed her not to the drawing room, but to Isabel's private study. This was a significant concession. It was a room rarely seen by visitors, a glimpse into the widow's personal sanctum. The study was a revelation. Unlike the formal reception rooms, this space spoke of intense intellect and controlled passion. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, crammed not just with leather-bound classics, but with volumes on botany, toxicology, chemistry, and obscure local history. A large mahogany partner desk dominated the room, its surface meticulously organized. A microscope sat on a stand beside a neat stack of notebooks. A Persian rug, rich with intricate patterns in deep blues and reds, covered the polished floorboards. The overall impression was one of formidable order, a mind that demanded precision. Isabel Fortescue rose from behind the desk as Miss Marple entered. She wore a simple, elegant dress of dove-gray wool, her dark hair swept back in a severe chignon. She looked pale, the faint shadows under her eyes more pronounced than at the garden party,
but her smile was warm, her voice composed. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to return the book personally. Please, do come in. Sit down. Can I offer you tea, or perhaps something stronger? It's been a trying few days." She gestured towards a comfortable armchair upholstered in worn leather. "Tea would be lovely, thank you, Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, placing the book on a nearby table. She settled into the chair, her gaze sweeping the room with apparent curiosity, but in reality cataloging every detail. The botany books, prominently displayed, the microscope, the neatness, the rug. Isabel rang a small silver bell. Moments later, the maid appeared with a tray. A delicate china teapot, cups, a plate of freshly baked scones, clotted cream, and a pot of strawberry jam. Isabel poured the tea with practiced grace, her movements economical and precise. "I'm afraid George rather neglected this book after he borrowed it. I think he was more interested in the financial sections. Though he did mention finding your marginal notes on the Saxon land grants quite illuminating." "It was a fascinating period," Miss Marple murmured, taking a sip of the excellent tea. She watched as Isabel placed a scone on her own plate, added a precise dollop of cream, and then a careful spoonful of jam. Not a drop spilled, not a crumb escaped. The meticulousness was palpable. "Indeed," Isabel agreed. "History is so often shaped by the control of land and resources. Much like gardens in a way." She offered the plate of scones to Miss Marple. "Do try one, Miss Marple. Cook's specialty." "Thank you, I will." Miss Marple selected a scone. As she reached for the cream, she allowed her hand to tremble slightly, a calculated, age-appropriate tremor. The spoon clattered against the porcelain dish. A small shower of golden crumbs scattered onto the rich fabric of the Persian rug near her feet. "Oh, dear me!" Miss Marple exclaimed, her voice flustered. "How clumsy of me! I am so terribly sorry, Mrs. Fortescue. Your beautiful rug!" Isabel's reaction was instantaneous and revealing. Her serene expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes snapped to the crumbs on the rug, her gaze fixing on them with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the minor accident. Without a word, she set her own teacup down with deliberate care, rose from her chair, and retrieved a small, ornate handbrush and dustpan from a drawer in the desk. "Not at all, Miss Marple," she said, her voice still smooth, but lacking its earlier warmth. "These old rugs can be so treacherous." She knelt swiftly beside the chair and began to brush the crumbs into the dustpan with meticulous, almost feverish care. Each crumb was targeted, swept up, the brush strokes precise and thorough. She didn't just clear the visible area. She examined the surrounding pattern of the rug, her eyes scanning the intricate weave for any stray particle. It was the action of someone for whom order was not just a preference, but an obsession. Someone who would notice a single thread out of place. Someone who would ensure a crime scene was left unnaturally clean. Miss Marple watched, her own expression one of contrite apology, but her mind was racing. This was it, the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized the scene of Finch's murder. The untouched valuables, the lack of disturbance in the rosebed, was mirrored in Isabel's reaction to a few spilled crumbs. It wasn't just tidiness, it was a deep-seated need for control, for erasing any trace of disorder. It was the hallmark of a mind that planned meticulously and executed cleanly. "There," Isabel said finally, rising smoothly and replacing the brush. She dusted off her hands. "Good as new, no harm done." She offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
She resumed her seat, but the relaxed atmosphere of moments before had evaporated. A subtle tension now thrummed between them. "You are most kind, Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, taking a bite of her scone. She chewed slowly, then leaned forward slightly, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "I couldn't help noticing your remarkable collection of books. Botany seems to be a particular interest." Isabel's guard went up instantly. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her cup. "Oh, a passing fancy, Miss Marple. George was passionate about his roses. I found it helpful to understand their care, their peculiarities," she dismissively replied. "Peculiarities," Miss Marple echoed softly. "Indeed, some plants have such fascinating properties, medicinal and otherwise. I was reading only yesterday about monkshood, such a beautiful flower, yet so deadly. Quite alarming, really, how easily one might confuse it with something harmless if one weren't an expert." She watched Isabel's face like a hawk. The effect was electric. Her knuckles whitened on the cup. A flicker of something, shock, fear, calculation, flashed in her eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. She took a controlled sip of tea, buying a fraction of a second. "Monkshood," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes, Aconitum napellus. Nasty stuff. Common enough in cottage gardens, surprisingly. People often underestimate the dangers. One must be so careful with identification and application." She emphasized the last word slightly, then seemed to catch herself. "But really, Miss Marple, this is hardly cheerful tea-time conversation, especially given recent events." She attempted a light laugh, but it sounded brittle. "Application," Miss Marple pressed gently, ignoring the attempt to deflect. "You mean in herbal remedies or other uses?"
Isabel set her cup down with a sharp click. Her composure, so carefully maintained, showed a hairline fracture. "Miss Marple, I'm not sure I appreciate the implication. My interest is purely academic, born of managing a large garden, and I failed to see what a poisonous plant has to do with poor Mr. Finch's murder, or the dreadful accusations against Dr. Haydock." Her voice had lost its smoothness. A sharp edge had appeared. "No implication intended, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly, though her eyes remained keenly observant. "It's just that Mr. Finch was asking questions about unexpected deaths, and Sir George's passing was so very sudden. One hears stories, you know, about certain plants being used, historically, to mimic natural causes." She let the statement hang, a delicate poison in the air. Isabel stared at her, the mask slipping completely for a second, revealing a glimpse of cold fury and fear. Then, just as quickly, it was back in place, colder than before. "That is a monstrous suggestion, Miss Marple. George died of a heart attack, certified by Dr. Haydock. To suggest otherwise is slanderous. And as for Finch, the evidence points clearly to Haydock's blackmail and subsequent violence. The police have the letters." Her voice was low, controlled, but vibrating with suppressed tension. "The letters are certainly damning," Miss Marple conceded evenly. "And yet the method, that precise wound, it suggests a very particular kind of knowledge, medical, perhaps, or botanical." She let her gaze drift pointedly towards the bookshelves laden with volumes on toxicology and plant alkaloids. "One wonders who else, besides a doctor, might possess such specialized knowledge." Isabel followed her gaze. Her lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. She stood up abruptly, the movement sharp and graceless.
I think, Miss Marple, that tea is concluded. Thank you for returning the book. I'm afraid I have some estate matters that require my attention." Her dismissal was icy, final. Miss Marple rose slowly, unhurried. She met Isabel's frigid gaze directly. "Of course, Mrs. Fortescue. Thank you for the tea. It was most revealing." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And your scones were exceptional. Such precision in the baking. It speaks of a remarkable attention to detail, a quality that must serve you well in managing a complex household and garden." The double meaning was unmistakable. Isabel flinched as if struck. The fragile constructed facade of the elegant grieving widow cracked wide open, revealing the steely, dangerous core beneath. Her eyes, usually so controlled, blazed with a mixture of fury and fear. She said nothing, merely stood rigidly, her hands clenched at her sides. Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of triumph, but of grim acknowledgement. She had seen what she needed to see. She had confirmed the obsessive nature, the specialized knowledge, and the capacity for cold fury when cornered. The crumbs on the rug had been more revealing than any confession. "Good day, Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said softly, and turned to leave. She walked out of the study, down the grand staircase, and out of the manor house without looking back. The heavy front door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the hall. Inside the study, Isabel remained standing for a long moment after Miss Marple's departure. The fragile teacup she still held trembled violently. With a choked sound of rage, she hurled it against the far bookshelf. It shattered, china and tea splattering across the spines of the botanical texts. She stared at the mess, her chest heaving, the mask completely gone. Revealed was a face contorted with fear and a terrifying, calculating rage. The old woman had seen too much, had probed too deeply. The crumbs, the mention of monkshood, the pointed questions about knowledge and application. It was an accusation disguised as polite conversation. Isabel sank into her chair, her mind racing. Miss Marple knew, or suspected enough to be dangerous. The police, focused on Haydock, might be diverted, but this old woman, she saw patterns, connections. She was a threat, a loose end that needed tidying up, like the crumbs on the rug, like the evidence left behind, like Alistair Finch. That thought chilled her, even as it crystallized her resolve. She had worked too hard, planned too meticulously to be undone by a meddling old maid with a penchant for knitting and seeing the worst in everyone. She would have to be dealt with, carefully, precisely, just like the others. Outside, walking down the manor house drive, Miss Marple felt the weight of the encounter settle upon her. The air seemed colder, the shadows deeper. She had poked the hornet's nest, and the queen was furious. The veiled threats in Isabel's eyes, the shattered cup she could almost hear, they were clear warnings. Miss Marple was no longer just an observer, she was now a player, and potentially a target. She reached the end of the drive and paused, looking back at the imposing facade of the manor house. It looked serene, beautiful, a monument to wealth and taste. But Miss Marple knew it housed a heart of darkness, a mind capable of meticulous murder. The crumb test had confirmed Isabel's obsessive nature. The botanical books confirmed her knowledge. The shattered cup confirmed her capacity for violence when cornered. The pieces were locking into place with chilling certainty. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and continued her walk back towards the village. Her steps were measured, her expression calm, but her mind was a whirlwind of strategy. She needed to act.
She needed to ensure Inspector Davies understood the significance of the monkshood leaf she had given him, and she needed to find a way to prove the connection between Isabel, the poison, and the forged letters implicating Haydock. And she needed to do it before Isabel decided that another accident or heart attack was necessary to protect her secrets. The game had escalated. The next move could be fatal. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her knitting bag, the familiar click of the needles inside a small, defiant sound against the encroaching danger. She had outwitted killers before, with a smile and a teacup. This time, she might need more than just crumbs.
Chapter 6. The Clock Struck Death. The revelation of Isabel Fortescue's chilling composure and botanical knowledge, coupled with her explosive reaction to the crumb test, left Miss Marple in no doubt. The elegant widow was at the heart of the darkness surrounding Sir George's death and Alistair Finch's murder. Yet proving it remained a formidable challenge. Inspector Davies, buoyed by the damning blackmail letters, remained fixated on Dr. Haydock, viewing the physician as the sole architect of the crimes. The monkshood leaf Miss Marple had provided was being analyzed, but Davies treated it as circumstantial, a potential red herring planted by Haydock to confuse the investigation. Miss Marple needed something irrefutable, something that shattered Haydock's carefully constructed alibi and pointed directly towards the manor house. The answer, she suspected, lay not in poisons or letters, but in the meticulous manipulation of time itself. Her thoughts turned to the timeline of Finch's murder. Dr. Haydock had provided a seemingly solid alibi. He claimed to have been attending to elderly Mrs. Arbuthnot at her cottage on the far side of the village from dusk until well after midnight on the night Finch was killed. Mrs. Arbuthnot, frail and confused, had corroborated this, though her recollection was hazy. But Miss Marple recalled a detail from the vicar's garden: the position of the body, the lack of dew on Finch's clothing near the wound, suggesting he'd been killed before the heaviest dew settled around 4 a.m. Haydock's alibi placed him away until nearly 1 a.m. There was a window, but it was tight. Unless the alibi itself was fabricated. And what better way to fabricate time than with a clock? The vicarage possessed a magnificent antique grandfather clock that stood sentinel in the hallway. It was a focal point, a symbol of order in the Binnings household. Miss Marple also knew that Isabel Fortescue, in her role as the late Sir George's wife, had been a frequent visitor to the vicarage, often assisting Esther with parish functions. She would have had ample opportunity to observe the clock, to understand its mechanism. Could it be tampered with? Could its hands be advanced or retarded to create a false timeline? It was an audacious plan, requiring nerve and precision, qualities Isabel possessed in abundance. To test her theory, Miss Marple needed access to the clock. She also needed to recreate the events of the murder night as accurately as possible. A casual visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to offer continued support to the shaken Esther, provided the perfect cover. She arrived mid-afternoon, finding Esther alone in the drawing room, listlessly arranging flowers. The strain was etched deeply on her face. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Esther said, though her smile lacked warmth. "Do come in. Caleb is still with Inspector Davies, going over things again." She gestured vaguely towards the study, where Davis's voice could be heard, raised in frustration. "My dear, you look exhausted," Miss Marple said kindly, taking a seat. "This relentless pressure is unbearable. Have you eaten? I brought some seed cake, a little something to keep your strength up." She placed a tin on the table. Esther managed a weak smile. "You're too kind, Miss Marple. Truly. But I find I have little appetite. The thought of that poor man, in our garden, and now Dr. Haydock. It's all too much."
She shuddered. "One tries to make sense of it," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. "The inspector seems convinced of Dr. Haydock's guilt, but the method, that precise wound, it feels so calculated, almost ritualistic. And the timing, it must have required such exactitude." "Timing?" Esther echoed, looking puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Well," Miss Marple said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "Dr. Haydock's alibi relies on him being with Mrs. Arbuthnot until very late. But if the murder occurred earlier, say just after midnight, then his alibi might not hold. Unless," she paused dramatically, "unless the time itself was manipulated to make it seem later than it was." "Manipulated? How?" "Through a clock, perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "A large, prominent clock, like your beautiful grandfather clock in the hall. If someone could advance its hands, say by an hour, then anyone checking the time later would believe it was later than it actually was, creating a false window of opportunity." She watched Esther's face carefully. Esther's eyes widened slightly. "Our clock? But it's so old. Surely it's not possible. And who would—" She voice trailed off as the implication dawned. "You mean someone might have tampered with it to give Dr. Haydock a false alibi, or to give themselves one?" "Precisely, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "It would require someone who knew the clock well, who had access to it, and who understood the importance of timing in such a delicate matter." She let the words hang, allowing Esther to connect the dots to Isabel's frequent visits. Esther paled. "Isabel, she was here the day before the murder, helping me sort hymnals. She was in the hall near the clock for quite some time. I thought nothing of it. She said she admired the craftsmanship." "Surely not. She's always been so proper." "Human nature is full of surprises, Esther," Miss Marple said gently, "especially when great fortunes or deep secrets are involved. Might I take a closer look at the clock, just to satisfy my own curiosity? It's such a fine piece." Esther, looking dazed, nodded numbly. "Of course, Miss Marple, of course, though I don't know what you expect to find. Caleb has it checked regularly." Miss Marple rose and walked into the grand hallway. The grandfather clock stood majestically against the wall, its polished wood gleaming. The rhythmic tick-tock filled the silent space. She approached it slowly, her eyes scanning every detail. The face was ornate with Roman numerals. The hands were heavy brass. She examined the glass casing, looking for scratches or signs of forced entry. Nothing obvious.
She carefully opened the glass door. The mechanism inside was a marvel of gears and weights. She peered closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. And then she saw it. Near the central arbor, where the hands were attached, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch on the brass gear wheel. It was fresh, bright metal showing through the patina. More tellingly, there were faint, greasy smudges on the inside of the glass door, near the latch, as if someone with slightly oily fingers, from handling clock mechanisms, had touched it recently. And on the minute hand itself, near the central pin, there was a microscopic fleck of what looked like dark green paint, the exact shade of the trim on the manor house's garden tools shed. Miss Marple's heart gave a little leap. This was it. Physical evidence. Tampering. And the paint fleck? A potential link directly to Isabel and the gardens. She carefully closed the glass door, making a mental note of the scratch's position and the smudges. Returning to the drawing room, she found Esther pacing nervously. "Well," Esther asked anxiously, "did you find anything?" "Nothing conclusive, my dear," Miss Marple said calmly, not wanting to alarm Esther further. "Just an old clock keeping time. But it did set me thinking about the sequence of events that night." She settled back into her chair.
Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the killer needed to establish an alibi that placed them elsewhere during the critical time. Suppose they knew Finch would be in the vicarage garden around midnight, perhaps lured there. They could commit the act quickly, then hurry to their alibi location, say Mrs. Arbuthnot's cottage. But if Finch was killed at, say, 12:15 a.m., and Mrs. Arbuthnot only confirms seeing the alibi provider at 1 a.m., that leaves 45 minutes unaccounted for. Risky. But if the clock at the alibi location was advanced by an hour before the provider arrived, then when they arrived at the actual time of 12:30 a.m., the clock would show 1:30 a.m. Mrs. Arbuthnot, confused, would later recall them being there at around 1:30, providing a solid alibi for the time of the murder at 12:15 a.m. Perfect. Esther stared, mesmerized by the logic. But how could they advance the clock at Mrs. Arbuthnot's? She lives alone. Ah, Miss Marple said, tapping her nose. They wouldn't need to. They would advance this clock, here, at the vicarage, where Finch was killed. Suppose the killer arrived at the vicarage garden around 11:45 p.m. They quickly advanced the grandfather clock in the hall by 1 hour. It now showed 12:45 a.m. instead of 11:45 p.m. They then met Finch, perhaps lured by a note, committed the murder swiftly and silently around 12 a.m., real time. They then hurried to Mrs. Arbuthnot's cottage, arriving around 12:30 a.m., real time. Mrs. Arbuthnot's own clock, probably a small bedside one, might be slow or unreliable. She sees her visitor, notes the time on her own clock as perhaps around 12:30, but later, when questioned by police, she remembers the visitor being there late, after 1, because the prominent time she associates with the night is the advanced time she saw on the vicarage clock earlier, or the killer subtly reinforced the later time. The police check Mrs. Arbuthnot's vague recollection against Haydock's story, and it seems to fit. But the real time of the murder, confirmed by the body's condition and the lack of dew, was earlier. The advanced clock here created the illusion of a later time, strengthening Haydock's alibi, or providing one for the real killer if they were seen elsewhere. Esther sank into a chair, looking overwhelmed. It's diabolical. But why advance this clock? Because it's the most prominent timepiece in the immediate vicinity of the crime. Its time would be noted subconsciously by anyone in the house that night, the vicar, perhaps, returning late, or even the killer themselves, to reinforce the deception. It anchors the false timeline. And who had the opportunity? Who was here that afternoon? Who admired the clock? Isabel. The name hung unspoken in the air between them. Just then, the study door burst open, and Inspector Davies strode out, his face flushed with irritation. Binnings is being impossible, insists I'm overlooking something. Overlooking what? The evidence against Haydock is clear as day. Letters, motive, opportunity. He stopped, seeing Miss Marple. Oh, Miss Marple, still poking your nose in, I see. Inspector Davies, Miss Marple said calmly, rising to her feet. A word, if I may. It concerns the timeline of Mr. Finch's murder and Dr. Haydock's alibi. Davies sighed impatiently. Miss Marple, we've been through this. Mrs. Arbuthnot confirms she saw Dr. Haydock at her cottage late that night. Yes, but when did she see him? And what time was it actually? I believe there's been a manipulation of time itself. She gestured towards the hallway. Specifically, involving that clock. Davies looked skeptical. The grandfather clock? What nonsense! It keeps perfect time. Caleb winds it religiously. Does it? Miss Marple asked mildly. "Perhaps you should examine it more closely, Inspector. Specifically, the mechanism near the hands and the inside of the glass door. You might find recent signs of tempering, a fresh scratch on the gear wheel, greasy smudges, and perhaps," she added, her voice dropping slightly, "a microscopic fleck of what looked like dark green paint, the exact shade of the trim on the manor house's garden tool shed."
"I'm suggesting, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gaining quiet authority, "that the alibi protecting Dr. Haydock, or perhaps the real killer, is a fabrication. That the clock in this very hallway was advanced by approximately 1 hour on the night of the murder. This created a false timeline, making it seem that events occurred later than they actually did. It provided a window for the murder to take place while the supposed alibi holder appeared to be elsewhere. And the person who advanced that clock, she stated, looking Davies directly in the eye, is someone who had access to this house, knowledge of the clock's mechanism, and a compelling reason to ensure Dr. Haydock took the fall. Someone like Isabel Fortescue." Davies was silent for a long moment, processing this. The sheer audacity of the plan, the meticulousness, resonated with the precision of the murder itself. The untouched valuables, the specific wound, and now a manipulated timeline. It painted a picture of a killer far more cunning and ruthless than the blackmailer Haydock. "The paint," Davies muttered. "Manor house shed." He looked towards the hallway, then back to Miss Marple, a new determination hardening his features. "Right. Peters, get in here, and bring my fingerprint kit. We're examining that clock, thoroughly." He turned back to Miss Marple, a reluctant respect in his eyes. "If you're right, Miss Marple, this changes everything." "I believe I am, Inspector," Miss Marple said simply. "The truth often hides in the smallest details, a scratch, a smudge, a fleck of paint, and the relentless silent passage of time, manipulated by a steady hand." As Davies barked orders and Constable Peters scrambled to obey, Miss Marple stood quietly in the hallway, watching the inspector begin his meticulous examination of the grandfather clock. He found the scratch on the gear wheel almost immediately. He peered at the smudges on the glass. He carefully scraped the minuscule fleck of dark green paint from the minute hand using a pair of tweezers, placing it in a tiny evidence envelope. His initial skepticism was melting away, replaced with a grim focus. "Right," Davies said finally, straightening up, the envelope held carefully. "This paint needs analysis, but the location, the freshness of the scratch, it's suggestive, Miss Marple, very suggestive. It gives us a direct physical link between the clock and the manor house gardens, and it blows Haydock's alibi wide open. If the clock was advanced, then the time Mrs. Arbuthnot saw him could easily be earlier than she recalls. He could have been here, but more importantly," he met Miss Marple's gaze, "it gives Isabel Fortescue both the means and the opportunity to fabricate that alibi, to frame Haydock, and to commit the murder herself within the newly created window." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. "The pieces are aligning, Inspector. The motive, inheritance, protecting secrets. The means, knowledge of aconite, access to forge litters. The opportunity, access to the gardens, the vicarage, the clock. And now this evidence of meticulous planning. The pattern is clear." Davies nodded grimly. "We need to bring Isabel Fortescue in for formal questioning. Confront her with this. But carefully. She's dangerous, and we still need definitive proof linking her to the poison itself and to Finch's presence in the garden that night." He paused. "You've done good work here, Miss Marple. I may have underestimated you." "Think nothing of it, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured.
One does what one can for the peace of St. Mary Mead. As Davies organized his men to secure the clock evidence and prepare for the confrontation with Isabel, Miss Marple took her leave of the still stunned Esther. She walked out of the vicarage into the late afternoon sun. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. The clock's deception had been exposed, the false alibi shattered. The path to Isabel Fortescue's door was now clear. But as she walked down the lane, a prickling sensation ran down her spine. She glanced back towards the manor house, visible on its hill. For a fleeting instant, she thought she saw a figure standing at an upstairs window, Isabel's window, watching her. The figure was too far away to see clearly, but Miss Marple felt the weight of that gaze, cold and assessing. Isabel knew. She would know the clock had been discovered. She would know the net was closing. Miss Marple tightened her shawl around her shoulders and continued walking, her steps measured but purposeful. The game was reaching its climax. The next move belonged to Isabel, and Miss Marple knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that a cornered predator like Isabel Fortescue would not go quietly. The clock had struck death once. Miss Marple feared it might not be the last time. She needed to be ready. The final threads of the deadly tapestry were being pulled, and the picture they revealed was one of cold, calculated evil.
Chapter 7. A Web of Lies. The discovery of the tampered grandfather clock had sent a tremor through the investigation, shifting the axis of suspicion squarely onto Isabel Fortescue. Inspector Davies, though still grumbling about amateur sleuths, was now operating with a renewed sense of purpose. The analysis of the paint fleck confirmed it matched the trim on the manor house's garden shed, a damning physical link. Mrs. Arbuthnot, re-interviewed with gentle persistence by Miss Marple herself, who arrived bearing homemade barley water and soothing platitudes, admitted her memory of when Dr. Haydock visited was hazy. She recalled him being there late, but couldn't swear if it was before or after midnight. The clock's manipulation had effectively shattered Haydock's alibi, leaving him exposed, but also, paradoxically, making him seem less likely as the sole perpetrator. Why frame yourself so elaborately? The logic pointed towards someone else using Haydock as a convenient scapegoat. Isabel, summoned for formal questioning, had met the inspector's inquiries with an icy, impenetrable calm. She denied any knowledge of the clock tampering, dismissed the paint fleck as absurd contamination, and professed shock at the suggestion she might forge letters. Her composure was unnerving, a fortress of plausible deniability built on the foundation of her social standing and the lack of direct evidence linking her to the act of murder. Davies released her pending further inquiries, a decision that left the village buzzing and Miss Marple deeply uneasy. Isabel was free, and Miss Marple knew, with chilling certainty, that a predator at liberty was a dangerous thing. The puzzle, however, had deepened. The forged letters were sophisticated. While Isabel possessed the intelligence and access to Haydock's handwriting, the sheer effort involved, obtaining samples, practicing the forgery, planting the letters, suggested more than just a frantic cover-up. It hinted at premeditation, at a plan already in motion before Finch's death. And Finch's own investigation, he hadn't just stumbled upon Sir George's murder, he'd been digging into unexpected deaths connected to the village, plural. Miss Marple needed to understand the scope of Isabel's ambition. How far back did the web of lies stretch? Her thoughts turned to the village's history, the skeletons rattling in closets Finch had sought to exhume. Edward Fortescue's gambling debts were well known, but were they the only motivation? And who else stood to gain if Sir George and then Finch were removed? The answer, she suspected, lay not in the obvious players, but in the shadows they cast. She decided to revisit the scene of Finch's research, the village church records, housed in a dusty annex behind the vestry. Finch had spent hours there. What had he seen that others missed? The annex was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and stone dust. Sunlight streamed weakly through a high, grimy window. Miss Marple, armed with permission from the now preoccupied Reverend Binnings, began methodically examining the registers Finch had requested: births, deaths, marriages, particularly those involving the Fortescue family and their associates over the past 50 years. She scanned the neat entries, her eyes accustomed to deciphering faded ink and archaic script. She found Sir George's death entry: George Alistair Fortescue, died 15th March, cause cardiac arrest, certified by R. Haydock, M.D., standard, unremarkable. She flipped back further. Edward's birth, Isabel's marriage to George, nothing unusual. She moved to the burial records, cross-referencing, and then, tucked between entries for 2 elderly parishioners who died of natural causes in the winter of 1947, she saw it. A small, almost illegible notation in the margin, written in a different hand, possibly added later. E.P. Found drowned millstream. Verdict: misadventure. No next of kin notified. No corresponding death entry in the main register. No burial record. Just this cryptic, hidden note. E.P. Who was E.P.? And why the secrecy? No next of kin notified suggested someone didn't want questions asked. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This felt like one of Finch's unexpected deaths. She pulled out the register for the previous year, 1946. Scanning, she found it. Emily Parker, died 12th November, cause pneumonia, certified by R. Haydock, M.D. Emily Parker, E.P. But the margin note said drowned. A clear contradiction. Why would the official record state pneumonia if the body was found drowned? And why hide the drowning reference? She remembered something else. Mrs. Price Ridley, in one of her gossip sessions, had mentioned a young woman who worked at the manor house years ago, a maid or companion, who'd met a sad end. Could that be Emily Parker? And what was her connection to the Fortescues? To Sir George? To Isabel, who arrived on the scene much later? Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Miss Marple sought out the oldest resident of St. Mary Mead, Miss Amelia Trim, a nonagenarian whose memory, though sometimes foggy on recent events, was remarkably sharp for the village's distant past. She found Miss Trim in her cottage, surrounded by knitted shawls and smelling faintly of lavender and camphor. "Miss Trim," Miss Marple began, settling into a hard-backed chair, "I was looking through the old church records and came across a name that piqued my curiosity. Emily Parker. Does that name mean anything to you?" Miss Trim's faded blue eyes sharpened. "Emily Parker? Bless you, yes. Poor dear. Such a tragedy. Worked up at the manor house, she did. Companion to Sir George's first wife, Lady Eleanor. Sweet girl, quiet, kept to herself mostly. Died of pneumonia, I believe?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Pneumonia. That's what they put in the register, no doubt. But we all knew better. Found her in the millstream, she was. Cold as ice. Coroner said misadventure. Slipped and fell, they said. But Emily, she was as sure-footed as a mountain goat. Knew those paths like the back of her hand." Miss Trim leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And there was talk. Oh yes, there was always talk." "What kind of talk, Miss Trim?" "About Sir George," the old woman said, her eyes gleaming with remembered scandal. He was attentive to Emily. Too attentive, some said. Lady Eleanor, she was poorly. Confined to her rooms. Didn't see much. But others, well, they saw Sir George walking out with Emily in the evenings, down by the stream. And then Emily turns up dead, drowned, and not long after, Lady Eleanor passes too. Broken heart, they said. Sir George marries that Isabel creature within the year. Convenient, wasn't it?" Miss Marple felt a cold dread seep into her bones. "You think Sir George was involved with Emily Parker? And that her death wasn't an accident?" "Involved?" Miss Trim cackled softly. "I'd say more than involved, dear. There were whispers she was in a certain condition,
if you take my meaning. A baby would have been uncomfortable, very uncomfortable for Sir George, especially with a sick wife. She tapped her nose knowingly. And who certified Lady Eleanor's death? Dr. Haydock's predecessor, old Dr. Peters. But Haydock was his junior then, learning the ropes. He'd have known the family, known the secrets.
The pieces began clicking into place with horrifying speed. Emily Parker, pregnant by Sir George, found drowned. Ruled misadventure. Lady Eleanor dies shortly after. Sir George marries Isobel. Fast forward decades. Sir George dies of a heart attack, potentially aconite poisoning, administered by Isobel, who learned the secret and used it to control him, then eliminated him. Alistair Finch starts digging into unexpected deaths. Emily Parker, Lady Eleanor, Sir George. He uncovers the truth. Isobel, protecting her inheritance and the dark secret of the manor house, silences him with aconite, then forges the blackmail letters to frame Haydock, manipulating the clock to create a false alibi for herself and incriminate the doctor. It wasn't just about Sir George's money. It was about covering up a decades-old murder, a web of lies spanning generations. But Miss Marple still needed proof, a connection between Isobel and Emily Parker, something tangible. And she needed to understand Haydock's role. Was he merely a pawn, or had he known about Emily Parker? Had he covered it up, making him vulnerable to Isobel's blackmail? The letters were in his handwriting. Had he written them, or had Isobel forged them so perfectly because she'd seen his writing on documents related to the Parker case? Her thoughts were interrupted by a timid knock at Miss Trim's door. It was young Jenny, the maid from the manor house, looking flustered. "Oh, Miss Trim, Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion, but Mrs. Fortescue sent me. She found something she thought belonged to Miss Marple. A glove? A lavender glove? She said it was found near the vicarage garden after everything. She thought Miss Marple might have dropped it." Jenny held out a small, clean, lavender kid glove. Miss Marple stared at it. It wasn't hers. She never wore lavender gloves. But it was exactly the type of expensive, elegant glove Isobel Fortescue would wear. And found near the vicarage garden, where Finch was killed? This wasn't a returned item. It was a message, a threat. "I know you're investigating. I know you were at the scene. I can place things there too." It was a chilling demonstration of Isobel's audacity and her reach. "Thank you, Jenny," Miss Marple said calmly, taking the glove. "How kind of Mrs. Fortescue. Please convey my gratitude." Her voice was steady, but her mind was racing. Isobel was baiting her, testing her, demonstrating her power. She was all so careless. Why send the glove via Jenny? Why not just dispose of it? Arrogance, the belief that she was untouchable. As Jenny scurried away, Miss Trim looked puzzled. "Your glove, Miss Marple? I didn't know you wore lavender." "I don't, Amelia," Miss Marple said softly, turning the glove over in her hands. Inside, faintly stamped in gold with the initials I.F. Isobel Fortescue. And there, caught near the cuff, was a tiny, almost invisible sliver of dark green wool, the same color as the gardening jumper Miss Marple had seen Isobel wearing while tending her roses, the same color as the trim on the shed. The glove hadn't just been near the garden. Isobel likely had been wearing it when she tended the monkshood, or when she advanced the clock. It was physical evidence linking Isabel directly to the crime scenes. But why return it? Why not dispose of it? Miss Marple realized with a jolt. It wasn't carelessness. It was a double bluff. If Miss Marple produced the glove, Isabel would claim she'd found it and returned it innocently. She'd twist it, suggesting Miss Marple had planted it to frame her. It was a trap. Isabel was forcing Miss Marple's hand, daring her to act, knowing the glove's provenance was now muddied. Miss Marple needed to act, but not directly. She needed to force Isabel into the open, to make her reveal her hand. She needed to confront her, not with evidence, but with the truth of the web she had woven. And she needed an audience. Inspector Davies needed to hear this. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested an urgent meeting with Davies at the vicarage. She found him in the study, poring over the forged letters and the clock report, looking frustrated. "Miss Marple, what is it? Another clock?" "Not a clock, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice grave. "A history, a dark history, that connects Emily Parker, Lady Eleanor Fortescue, Sir George, Alistair Finch, and now Isabel Fortescue. It's not just about money, Inspector. It's about a decades-old murder and the conspiracy to conceal it." She laid it all out: Emily Parker's drowning, the suspicious death of Lady Eleanor Fortescue, Sir George's hasty marriage to Isabel, Finch's investigation into unexpected deaths, the discovery of the hidden note in the register, Miss Trim's testimony about Sir George's affair and Emily's pregnancy. She explained how Isabel, upon learning the secret, perhaps from Sir George himself in a moment of weakness, or from old servants, used it to control him, then poisoned him with aconite to secure the inheritance. When Finch started digging, uncovering the Parker case and questioning Sir George's death, Isabel silenced him the same way, using her botanical knowledge. She forged the blackmail letters in Haydock's handwriting to frame him, manipulating the clock to create a false alibi for herself and incriminate the doctor. It wasn't just about Sir George's money. It was about covering up a decades-old murder, a web of lies spanning generations.
"The glove is compromised, Inspector," Miss Marple warned. "She returned it to me via her maid. She'll claim I planted it. We need her to incriminate herself. We need to force her to reveal her knowledge of Emily Parker." "How?" "By confronting her with the truth," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming with steely resolve. "By telling her we know about Emily, about the baby, about the drowning, about the web of lies she's spun to protect a fortune built on murder. We need to do it publicly, Inspector, where her composure might crack, where others can witness it." Davies nodded slowly, a grim understanding dawning. "The village fête, tomorrow. She'll be there, presiding over the cake stall. It's perfect, public but controlled." He looked at Miss Marple. "You'll do the talking?" "I will, Inspector, but you and Constable Peters must be nearby, and ready." The next day dawned bright and breezy, the village green transformed with bunting, stalls, and the cheerful chaos of the annual fête. The scent of candy floss and frying onions hung in the air. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual quiet attire, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, moved through the crowd like a wraith. She saw Isabel at the cake stall, a picture of serene elegance, accepting compliments on her lemon drizzle cake, her smile fixed, her eyes scanning the crowd with watchful calm. Miss Marple approached the stall, Davies and Peters positioned discreetly nearby. "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying clearly over the hubbub. "What a splendid cake! It speaks of remarkable precision.
much like your other endeavors." Isabel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Marple, how kind. I do try." Precision is so important, isn't it? Especially when concealing the past, when ensuring that inconvenient truths drown, so to speak, like poor Emily Parker. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Isabel's smile vanished, her face froze, then paled. The carefully constructed mask cracked, revealing a flicker of pure, naked panic. "Emily Parker?" Isabel repeated, her voice suddenly strained, lacking its usual smoothness. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do, Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but relentless, projecting to the small crowd that had begun to sense tension and gather. "Emily Parker, the young companion found drowned in the mill stream in 1947, ruled misadventure. But we both know it wasn't an accident, don't we? We know about Sir George's intentions, about the child she carried, a child that would have been an embarrassment, a threat to the Fortescue legacy. Just like Alistair Finch became a threat when he started uncovering the unexpected deaths surrounding your family. Emily Parker, Lady Eleanor, Sir George, and now Finch, all silenced to protect a secret and a fortune built on murder." Isabel recoiled as if struck. The composure shattered completely. Her eyes, wide and terrified, darted around the faces now staring at her, whispering. The color drained from her face, leaving it ashen. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only a choked gasp. "You used your knowledge of botany, Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple pressed, stepping closer, her voice dropping, but still carrying immense weight. "Monkshood, so precise, so clean, like your forgery of Dr. Haydick's letters, like your manipulation of the vicarage clock, meticulous. But the web you spun, Mrs. Fortescue, the web of lies stretching back decades, it has unraveled. Emily Parker deserves justice. Sir George deserves justice. Alistair Finch deserves justice. And you," Miss Marple stated, her voice ringing with finality, "you will face it." Isabel swayed. The elegant facade was gone, replaced by a portrait of terrified fury and despair. She looked from Miss Marple's implacable gaze to the advancing figures of Inspector Davies and Constable Peters. The crowd murmured, a wave of shock and dawning horror rippling through them. There was nowhere left to run. The web of lies was broken, its architect exposed in the bright, unforgiving light of the village fete. You can't prove," Isabel whispered, her voice a broken thread. "We can, Mrs. Fortescue," Inspector Davies said, his voice cold and official as he stepped forward. "We have the church records, we have testimony, we have the clock evidence, we have the paint, and we have your reaction. Miss Marple is quite right. The game is over." Isabel Fortescue, the elegant widow, the mistress of the manor house, the meticulous killer, looked at the ring of accusing faces, at the ruin of her carefully constructed world. A low, animal sound escaped her throat. Then, with a sudden, desperate movement, she lunged, not towards Miss Marple, but to the large, ornate tureen of hot punch simmering on a nearby stall. Her hand closed around the ladle. But Inspector Davies was faster. He tackled her, sending them both crashing to the ground amidst a shower of bunting and spilled punch. Constable Peters moved in swiftly, securing Isabel's flailing arms. She fought like a wildcat, her face contorted with rage and terror, her screams echoing across the suddenly silent green. "Murderess!" someone shouted from the crowd. "She killed them! Killed Emily! Killed Sir George! Killed Finch!" The accusation hung in the air, no longer a whisper, but a roar of truth. The web of lies was not just unraveled, it was torn apart, exposing the black heart at its center. Miss Marple stood amidst the chaos, her expression of profound sadness and grim satisfaction. She had outwitted the killer, not just with a smile and a teacup, but with the relentless pursuit of truth, exposing a conspiracy of silence and murder that had festered beneath the placid surface of St. Mary Mead for too long. The final thread had been pulled, and the monstrous pattern it revealed was complete.
Chapter 8. Tea for Two. The aftermath of Isabel Fortescue's arrest at the village fete rippled through St. Mary Mead like a stone cast into a placid pond, leaving concentric circles of shock, gossip, and dawning horror. The cheerful bunting seemed suddenly garish, the scent of candy floss cloying against the lingering memory of Isabel's screams and the spilled punch staining the grass. Inspector Davies, his face grimly satisfied, had personally escorted the struggling, disheveled widow to the waiting police car, her elegant facade utterly shattered, replaced by the raw, terrified fury of a trapped predator. Constable Peters, looking pale but resolute, followed, clutching the evidence bag containing the damning lavender glove. Miss Marple, however, felt no sense of triumph, only a profound weariness and a chilling certainty that the web, though rent, might not be entirely destroyed. Isabel's desperate lunge for the punch ladle hadn't been mere hysteria. It was the instinctive strike of a cornered animal, a final, futile attempt to lash out. It spoke of a mind that, even in defeat, sought to inflict damage. And her eyes, just before Davies tackled her, Miss Marple hadn't seen defeat in them. She'd seen calculation, a frantic assessment of escape routes, of potential weaknesses in the net closing around her. It was a look that whispered, "This isn't over." The village was abuzz, but Miss Marple needed quiet. She needed to think. She needed to assess the damage and, more importantly, to identify any surviving threads of the conspiracy. Isabel had been the architect, the spider at the center, but had she spun her web entirely alone? The forgeries, the clock manipulation, the procurement and application of aconite, it required knowledge, access, and nerve. Isabel possessed all three in abundance. But had she had help, an accomplice, someone who benefited from the Fortescue secrets remaining buried, someone who might now be feeling exposed? Her thoughts drifted to Dr. Haydock, vindicated, yes, but deeply traumatized. The revelation of the forged letters, the implication that his handwriting had been used to frame him for murder and blackmail, had shaken him to his core. He was a proud man, a dedicated physician. The attack on his professional integrity was a wound deeper than any physical threat. Miss Marple decided a visit was in order, not just to offer solace, but to glean any insight he might possess, any detail, however small, that Isabel might have let slip during their professional interactions, or any anomaly he'd noticed concerning Sir George's final illness or Emily Parker's long-ago death. She found the doctor in his surgery, not seeing patients, but staring blankly out the window, a half-empty cup of cold tea before him. The usual orderliness of the room felt strained, papers stacked haphazardly, a medical journal lying open and ignored. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, the spark of his usual brisk confidence extinguished. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said softly, closing the door gently behind her. He started, turning slowly. "Miss Marple, forgive me. I was elsewhere." "Understandably, doctor," she murmured, taking the seat opposite his desk. "The events of the past days have been overwhelming for us all." He managed a weak, bitter smile. Overwhelming is a mild word. To be accused, to have one's name, one's life's work dragged through the mud like that, based on forgeries so convincing even I— He broke off, shaking his head. Davies was profuse in his apologies, said I'd been instrumental in uncovering the truth. Instrumental? I was a pawn, a convenient scapegoat. A pawn who survived, Doctor, Miss Marple said firmly, and whose integrity is now, thanks to the evidence, irrefutably restored. The village knows the truth. They know Isabel forged those letters. Do they? Haydock sighed, rubbing his temples. Or will they always wonder? A shadow remains, a stain. He looked at her, his eyes haunted. That woman, Isabel, the sheer audacity, the coldness, to use my handwriting, to implicate me in Finch's murder and God knows what else, and Emily Parker, I'd almost forgotten. A tragedy, certainly, but murder? Covering it up for decades? Did I know, deep down? Did I choose not to see? Doctor, you were a junior then, Miss Marple said gently, working under Dr. Peters. If there was a cover-up, it was orchestrated by others long before you had the authority to question it. Isabel exploited that history, that vulnerability. She used your established position and your handwriting samples, easily obtained over years of prescriptions, to build her trap. Perhaps, Haydock murmured, not convinced, but there was something. A look she gave me once, years ago, shortly after George died. She brought me some papers to sign regarding the estate. I made some offhand remark about George's heart being weak, how sudden it was. She smiled, a very thin smile, said, "Weakness can be such a relative term, Doctor, especially when it comes to hearts." I thought nothing of it at the time, just a rather odd, aristocratic turn of phrase. Now— He trailed off, the memory chilling him anew. A telling remark, Doctor, Miss Marple agreed, her mind filing it away. It was a subtle, almost poetic threat, revealing Isabel's mindset and her knowledge of aconite's effects. It suggested her planning began even then. She wasn't just reacting to Finch, she was consolidating her position long before he arrived. She leant forward slightly. Doctor, when you attended Sir George, was there anything unusual, beyond the expected symptoms of a heart attack? Any smell on his breath? Any residue on his skin? Anything at all that seemed out of place? Haydock frowned, concentrating, dredging up the memory. It was chaotic, Miss Marple. He collapsed at the foot of the main staircase. Isabel was screaming. The staff were running about. I focused on the obvious. No pulse, cyanosis, classic cardiac arrest. I tried resuscitation, of course, but it was futile. He'd been gone some minutes. As for smells, there was the dust from the carpet polish, perhaps the faint scent of Isabel's perfume. Lilies, I think. Nothing that stood out, no unusual residue I noticed. But then again, I wasn't looking for poison. I was looking for signs of cardiac failure. He paused. Though, now that you mention it, his lips, they had a slight bluish tinge, more than I'd expect just from cyanosis, and his fingers, the tips were oddly tinged. I put it down to the severity of the attack. But aconite, wouldn't it cause tingling, numbness?
Precisely, Doctor, Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp. Tingling and numbness of the extremities are classic early signs. You observed it, but interpreted it through the lens of your expectation, a heart attack. Isabel counted on that, on medical professionals seeing what they expected to see. She stood up. Thank you, Doctor. This has been most helpful. Your recollection of Isabel's remark and the physical signs you noted, they add weight to the case. They confirm her method and her mindset. Haydock looked slightly less burdened. I'm glad I could contribute something useful, however belatedly. What happens now with Isabel? Inspector Davies will build the case, Miss Marple said. The evidence is strong. The glove, the clock, the paint, the monk's hood, the forgery analysis, your testimony, Miss Trim's, the church records, and now her public confession through reaction. But I fear, she hesitated, I fear she may not be done. Her desperation at the fete, it felt personal, directed, as if she wasn't just losing her freedom, but something else, or someone. Haydock looked alarmed. You think she has an accomplice? I think it's a possibility we must consider, Doctor, Miss Marple said gravely. Someone who helped her procure the aconite, who might have known about Emily Parker, who benefited from Sir George's death and the silencing of Finch, someone who might now feel exposed. She didn't name Edward Fortescue, but the implication hung in the air. Haydock paled further. Edward, he has a temper, and he hated George and Isabel, but murder and conspiracy? It seems beyond him. He's too impulsive, too obvious. Obvious can be a mask, Doctor, or a useful distraction. We must be vigilant. She took her leave, promising to keep him informed. As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the possibilities. Edward was the most obvious candidate for an accomplice, motive, opportunity, a grudge against both his father and Isabel. But his volatility made him a risky partner for someone as controlled as Isabel. Who else? Mrs. Gubbins. She saw everything but profited from gossip, not murder. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor. He knew the Fortescue secrets, but his livelihood depended on discretion. He seemed genuinely shaken by Isabel's arrest. Then there was the veiled woman, the visitor to Finch at the Grange, the one Mrs. Gubbins heard Finch call "my dear." Isabel herself? It was possible. She could have disguised herself. But why the elaborate subterfuge just to visit Finch? Why not confront him directly? Unless the "my dear" wasn't sarcastic. It was genuine. Unless Finch had an unexpected confidant, someone Isabel hadn't counted on. Someone who might now be in danger. Miss Marple paused by the war memorial, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. The veiled woman, cultured voice, well-dressed, familiar enough for Finch to use an endearment, who in St. Mary Mead fit that description and might have had a reason to be concerned about Finch's investigation into the Fortescues. Someone who might have warned him, or someone Isabel had manipulated to get close to Finch. A name surfaced, one that seemed almost too simple, too obvious, yet had been overlooked in the glare of Isabel's villainy. Lady Eleanor's sister. Miss Trim had mentioned Lady Eleanor had family, a sister, slightly younger, who had lived abroad for many years but had returned to England a few years prior, settling quietly in a nearby market town. Miss Trim recalled her visiting Lady Eleanor at the manor house before her death, a gentlewoman, refined. What if she had returned more permanently? What if she had reconnected with Finch, perhaps an old family friend or acquaintance? What if Finch, in his research, had confided in her? And what if Isabel, discovering this connection, had used the sister to get information or even to lure Finch to his death? It was a tenuous thread, but it resonated. Isabel was ruthless. She would exploit any connection, any vulnerability. If Finch trusted Lady Eleanor's sister, Isabel could have used that trust against him. The veiled woman, could it have been her, sent by Isabel under false pretenses, or acting independently, trying to warn Finch only to be silenced herself? Miss Marple needed to find out. She needed to speak to Lady Eleanor's sister. A visit to the market town of Chelmsford was required.
But first, she needed to ensure Isabel was securely contained and unable to orchestrate any further harm from her cell. The next morning brought news that confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears. Constable Peters arrived at her cottage, looking grim. "Miss Marple, Inspector Davies sent me. There's been an incident at the jail." Miss Marple's fart sunk. "Isabel?" "No, Miss Marple, it's secure, in solitary, but someone tried to visit her last night, claimed to be her solicitor, Mr. Petherick, showed forged credentials. Very good forgeries, the warden said, almost got through, but the duty solicitor, who actually handles Isabel's case, happened to be there, recognized the impostor, raised the alarm. The man, or rather the woman, dressed as a man, fled, got away in the confusion." "A woman disguised as a man?" Miss Marple echoed, her mind racing, trying to see Isabel, to pass a message, or to silence her. "Exactly, Miss Marple," Peters nodded. "Davies is frantic, thinks it might be an accomplice trying to either get instructions or eliminate Isabel before she talks. He's doubled the guard, but it's a bad business." "Did the warden get any description, anything distinctive?" "Tall for a woman, slender, wore a man's suit, hat pulled low, gloved hands, moved quickly. That's about it. Oh, and the warden did say she had a very cultured voice. Even trying to sound like a man, it came through. Polite, calm." A cultured voice, disguised, trying to reach Isabel. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle over her. This wasn't Edward Fortescue. This was someone refined, controlled, desperate. Someone who fit the description of the veiled woman. Someone like Lady Eleanor's sister. "Thank you, Constable Peters," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the chill. "Please tell Inspector Davies I may have a lead on the identity of this visitor, and I believe I know where she might go next." Peters looked startled. "You do? Where?" "To Chelmsford, Constable, to see Lady Eleanor's sister, but I suspect she may not go there directly. She'll be wary. She may try to contact Finch's landlady first, Mrs. Gubbins, to see if Finch left anything behind, anything that might implicate her. Or she may go to ground somewhere familiar, somewhere connected to the Fortescues, but overlooked." Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. "The Dower House. It's been empty for years since Lady Eleanor's mother died. Isabel kept it locked up, but someone familiar with the estate, someone like Lady Eleanor's sister, would know it exists. It would be a perfect hiding place, secluded, forgotten." Peters looked impressed. "The Dower House? Of course, it's just over the hill from the manor, tucked away in the woods. Davies, I need to tell Davies." He rushed out, nearly knocking over Miss Marple's geraniums.
Miss Marple didn't wait. She knew Peters would inform Davies, and Davies would dispatch men to the Dower House. But she also knew that if the accomplice was as cunning as Isabel, she might anticipate that. Miss Marple needed to get there first, not to confront, but to observe, to see who arrived, to understand the connection. She collected her knitting bag, a comforting, familiar weight, and slipped out of her cottage, taking the lesser-known footpaths that wound through the meadows and into the woods bordering the Fortescue estate. The Dower House was a small, stone-built cottage, once charming, now derelict and swallowed by ivy and brambles. It stood in a small clearing, its windows boarded up, the door warped and hanging slightly ajar. It felt forgotten, mournful. Miss Marple approached cautiously, using the dense undergrowth for cover. She found a position behind a thick yew tree overlooking the clearing. She settled in, the knitting bag resting beside her, and waited. The afternoon sun dappled through the leaves, birds sang, and the only sound was the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. Time passed slowly. Then, just as the light began to soften towards evening, she heard it. A twig snapping, carefully muffled. Movement in the trees to the left of the cottage. A figure emerged, moving stealthily, dressed in dark practical clothing, trousers, a tunic, a flat cap pulled low. It was definitely a woman, tall and slender, just as Peters described. She carried a satchel. She approached the dower house, paused, listening intently, then slipped inside through the walk door. Miss Marple waited, her senses heightened. Minutes stretched. Then the figure re-emerged, without the satchel. She looked around warily, then moved off quickly in the direction of the main road, not back towards the village, but towards Chelmsford. Miss Marple didn't follow. Her focus was the cottage. What had the woman left or retrieved? Once the figure was out of sight, Miss Marple moved. She approached the cottage door, pushed it open wider, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. Cobwebs draped the corners. In the center of the main room, on a rickety table, lay the satchel, untouched. Beside it, however, was something new. A small, leather-bound book, a diary. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, using her handkerchief. It was old, the leather cracked. She opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine. The entries spanned several years, ending abruptly about 18 months ago. The last few entries were frantic. October 12th. He knows. George knows about the letters. He confronted me, said he would expose everything unless I ceased my inquiries. He threatened to have me committed. The hypocrisy, after what he did to Emily, after what he did to Eleanor. I must be careful, so careful. October 15th. Alistair came today. He senses something is wrong. He saw George's rage. I told him nothing. I couldn't risk it. But he is persistent. He is digging near the mill stream. He found Emily's old scarf caught in the roots. He suspects. Oh God, what have I done? What will he do? October 18th. George is dead. The heart attack. Was it? Isabel was so calm. Too calm. She found my diary. I know she did. It was moved. She smiled at me today, a terrible smile. She knows I know. She knows about Emily, about Eleanor. She knows I told Alistair to look near the stream. She thinks I betrayed her, but I only wanted the truth, for Eleanor, for Emily. Now Alistair is dead too, murdered. And Isabel, she looks at me with those cold eyes. She blames me. She will silence me. I must run. I must hide this diary, where no one will find it, where she will never look. The dower house, Eleanor's childhood sanctuary. May God forgive me. The diary entry stopped there. Miss Marple's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an accomplice. This was Lady Eleanor's sister. Her name, signed at the bottom of an earlier entry, was Beatrice Langley. Beatrice hadn't been an accomplice. She'd been a co-conspirator in uncovering the truth, a source for Finch, and Isabel had discovered her involvement. Isabel not just killed Finch to silence him, she'd killed him to punish Beatrice, to demonstrate the cost of betrayal. And now Beatrice was in hiding, terrified Isabel would find her and finish the job. The attempt to visit Isabel in jail wasn't to pass messages or silence Isabel. It was likely a desperate attempt by Beatrice to plead her case, to offer a deal, to save herself. Or perhaps to retrieve this diary before the police did. The sound of a car approaching broke the silence. Miss Marple slipped the diary into her knitting bag and melted back into the cover of the yew tree just as Inspector Davis, Constable Peters, and 2 uniformed officers burst into the clearing. "Clear the house!" Davis shouted. "Carefully!" They entered the dower house. Moments later, Davis emerged, holding the satchel. He looked around, frustrated. Nothing, just an empty bag. She was here, though, recently. He spotted the disturbed dust on the table where the diary had been. Something was here, a book, papers. Miss Marple stepped out from behind the tree. "A diary, Inspector. Lady Eleanor's sister, Beatrice Langley." Davis spun around, his eyes wide. "Miss Marple? What are you—" "Beatrice Langley? She's the accomplice? The visitor?" "Not an accomplice, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice heavy with the tragedy of it. "A victim, and Finch's secret confidant.
She knew about Emily Parker. She suspected George killed Eleanor. She told Finch where to look. Isabel discovered her betrayal. Finch's murder was as much a warning to Beatrice as it was silencing him. She held out the diary. This tells the story. Beatrice hid it here. She came back for it. She is terrified Isabel will find her. Davis took the diary, his expression grim as he scanned the final entries. Dear God, so Isabel didn't just kill for money. She killed for revenge, for control, to punish anyone who threatened her secrets. He looked towards the road Beatrice had taken. We need to find Beatrice Langley, before Isabel does, or before she does something desperate. Miss Marple nodded. She'll go to ground, Inspector. Somewhere she feels safe, somewhere connected to Eleanor, but not obvious, not her own home in Chelmsford. Isabel would check there first. She thought for a moment. The convent, St. Agnes's convent, near Little Malling. Eleanor and Beatrice were educated there. Beatrice donated generously after Eleanor's death. The Mother Supreme is an old friend of the family. It's sanctuary, and Isabel, for all her power, wouldn't dare violate that. Davis nodded decisively. Peters, get on the radio. Contact the convent at Little Malling, discreetly. Ask if Beatrice Langley is there. If she is, she's not under arrest, but she needs protective custody. Tell them it's a matter of life and death. I'll arrange for an unmarked car to meet us there. He turned to Miss Marple. Miss Marple, will you come? She might talk to you before she talks to us. Miss Marple looked towards the darkening woods where Beatrice had disappeared, then back at the diary in Davis's hand. The web was more complex, more tragic than she had imagined. Isabel was the spider, yes, but Beatrice had been a fly caught in her own desperate web of truth-seeking. Finch had been the light that exposed it all and paid the price. Yes, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resolute. I will come. Beatrice Langley needs to understand that the truth, however painful, is the only sanctuary left, and that the spider, though caught, can still spin lies from her cell. We need to hear her story, all of it. She picked up her knitting bag, the diary a heavy weight inside it, and the final confrontation wasn't with Isabel in her cell. It was with the broken, terrified woman who had unwittingly helped set the tragedy into motion and now held the last vital pieces of the puzzle. Tea would be involved, Miss Marple knew. Tea and terrible truths.
Chapter 9. The Final Thread. The drive to St. Agnes's convent near Little Malling was conducted in a silence thick with unspoken dread. Inspector Davies gripped the steering wheel of the unmarked Wolseley, his knuckles white, his jaw set. Beside him, Constable Peters stared out the window at the rolling countryside, bathed in the fading gold of late afternoon, his face pale. In the back seat, Miss Marple sat composed, her knitting bag resting on her lap, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The tension in Davies' shoulders, the nervous tap of Peter's fingers, the way the shadows lengthened across the fields like grasping fingers. The diary of Beatrice Langley felt like a physical weight in her bag, a repository of secrets and sorrow. The convent itself appeared as they rounded a bend, a haven of serenity amidst the pastoral landscape. Gray stone walls, softened by ivy, surrounded neat gardens where roses and lavender bloomed in disciplined profusion. A tall, imposing bell tower pierced the sky. The air, even through the car window, smelled faintly of incense and old stone, a scent of peace and contemplation that felt jarringly at odds with the darkness they pursued. Davies pulled up discreetly near a side entrance. A nun in a simple gray habit, her face serene but her eyes watchful, awaited them. She introduced herself as Sister Mary Frances, the Mother Superior. "Inspector Davies, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and calm, yet carrying an undertone of concern. "Beatrice is within. She is deeply distressed, but unharmed. She has been praying almost constantly since her arrival this afternoon.
She led them through a cool, echoing corridor, the only sounds the soft shuffle of their feet and the distant, mournful tolling of the Angelus bell. They found Beatrice Langley in a small, sparsely furnished guest room, kneeling before a simple wooden crucifix, her back to them. She was the picture of abject grief and terror. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She wore a plain, dark dress, her hair unbound and straggling, her elegant refinement utterly stripped away, leaving only raw fear. She looked up as they entered, her eyes wide and haunted, darting between Davies, Peters, and finally settling on Miss Marple with a flicker of desperate recognition. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "you found it. The diary." "We did, my dear," Miss Marple said, gently moving forward. She didn't offer false comfort. "We know why you hid it. We know about Emily, about Eleanor's death, about what you told Alistair." Beatrice flinched as if struck. "Alistair. Oh, God, Alistair. Is it my fault? Did I lead him to his death by telling him to look near the mill stream? By giving him Eleanor's old letters hinting at George's cruelty?" She buried her face in her hands. "Isabel found out. She found a diary. She looked at me. And I knew she would kill him. And she did. Because of me." "Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but kind, cutting through the self-recrimination. "Isabel Fortescue killed Alistair Finch because he uncovered the truth about her crimes, because he threatened her inheritance and her freedom. Your information was a catalyst, yes, but the responsibility for his murder lies solely with Isabel. She is the architect of this tragedy, not you." Davies stepped forward, his tone official but softened by the circumstances. "Miss Langley, we need to take a formal statement. We need to know everything about Emily Parker, about Eleanor's death, about your interactions with Mr. Finch, and about Isabel's threats against you." Beatrice shrank back. "A statement? Will it be public? Will everyone know?" The humiliation and fear were palpable. "Details may need to be disclosed in court, yes, but your safety is paramount. We can offer protection." "Protection?" Beatrice gave a bitter, broken laugh. "From Isabel? Even in jail, she has reach. She has money. She has people. She promised me, Miss Marple. She looked at me after George died, after Alistair started digging, and she smiled that terrible smile and said, 'Secrets like ours, dear Beatrice, are best kept buried, deep, with those who know them.' I knew she meant me. I ran, but she found me at the Dower House. She knew I'd hide the diary there. She knows everything." Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and pulled out not the diary, but a small worn velvet pouch. "Beatrice, before we speak of Isabel's threats, I found something else tucked into the back of your diary, something I believe belongs to you." She opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her palm. It was a string of simple, dark wooden beads, well worn and smooth, a rosary, but threaded amongst the beads, almost hidden, were 3 tiny faded blue flowers, forget-me-nots, pressed and dried decades ago. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear now, but of profound, aching memory. "Eleanor's," she breathed. "Her rosary. She gave it to me the day before she died. She said, 'Keep this, Bee. Remember me. Remember the truth. Forget-me-nots, for the forgotten.' I thought I'd lost it forever." She reached out a trembling hand, and Miss Marple placed the rosary gently into her palm. Beatrice clutched it like a lifeline, the beads pressing into her skin. "Remember the truth," Miss Marple echoed softly. "That is what we need now, Beatrice. For Eleanor, for Emily Parker, for Alistair Finch. The truth is the only weapon we have against Isabel's lies. the only protection. The rosary seemed to anchor Beatrice. The frantic terror in her eyes receded slightly, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow, but also a flicker of resolve. She took a shuddering breath, clutching the beads. "Very well," she whispered. "You shall have the truth. All of it." She looked at Davies. "But may we have some tea? It seems appropriate." Sister Mary Frances, who had been waiting discreetly by the door, nodded. "Of course, Beatrice. I will arrange it." Minutes later, they were seated around a small table in the room. A simple pot of strong tea, plain biscuits, and 3 cups were arranged with quiet efficiency by the nun, who then withdrew, closing the door softly. The ritual of tea, the pouring, the clink of the cup, the warmth seeping into cold hands, provided a fragile scaffold for the terrible story Beatrice began to tell. "It started long before Isabel," Beatrice began, her voice low but steady, the rosary wrapped tightly around her fingers. "Eleanor and George, it was never a love match. It was an arrangement. George needed the respectability Eleanor's family name brought. Eleanor was gentle, kind, but fragile. She adored George at first, but he grew cold, distant, and then Emily Parker arrived."
Beatrice sipped her tea, gathering strength. Emily was Eleanor's companion, yes, but she was also vibrant, young, full of life. George noticed. He began paying her attention, walking with her in the gardens. Eleanor saw it. It broke her heart. But she was too proud, too ill by then to confront him directly. She confided in me. Her letters, the ones I gave Alistair, they spoke of her fears, of George's dark moods, of Emily's condition. "Emily was pregnant," Miss Marple prompted gently. Beatrice nodded miserably. "Yes, Emily came to me in terror. George had demanded she take care of it. He threatened her, said he'd ruin her, have her thrown out, leave her destitute if she didn't. She was terrified of him, but she was also terrified of losing the child. She loved George, foolish girl. She thought he might marry her if Eleanor wasn't there." Beatrice's voice dropped to a whisper. A week later, Eleanor was dead. Heart failure, Dr. Peters said. George was distraught, publicly. Privately, he was relieved, free. And Emily? Emily vanished. They said she ran away, ashamed. But I knew. "How?" Davies asked, leaning forward. "George," Beatrice said, her voice hardening. "He got drunk one night, shortly after Eleanor's funeral. He was ranting at me, blaming me for Eleanor's unhappiness, for stirring things up. He boasted, said Eleanor was weak, like her mother. A little something in her nightcap helped her along, and that little fool Emily thought she could threaten me. A walk by the stream, an unfortunate slip. The current is strong there. No more problems." He laughed, Miss Marple. He laughed. Beatrice's knuckles were white around the rosary beads. I was horrified, disgusted, but what could I do? Who would believe me against Sir George Fortescue? Dr. Peters signed the death certificates. The village accepted the stories. I was powerless. I left England shortly after. I couldn't bear it. "And you returned?" Miss Marple asked. "After George married Isabel," Beatrice said. "I heard rumors, whispers about her, how cold she was, how quickly she consolidated her power. I felt Eleanor needed someone to remember, to watch. So I came back, settled in Chelmsford. I kept an eye on things, from a distance. And then Alistair Finch arrived, asking questions about unexpected deaths, about George's will, about Isabel.
"Did you approach him?" Davies asked. "Not at first," Beatrice admitted. "I was cautious, but he was persistent. He came to see me in Chelmsford. He'd found out I was Eleanor's sister. He told me he suspected George hadn't died naturally, that he thought Isabel might have hastened things. He asked about Eleanor, about Emily. I saw the same determination in him that I had felt years ago, the need for truth. So I told him what George boasted to me. I told him about Emily's pregnancy and her fears. And I told him where Emily used to walk, near the mill stream, where George said she slipped. I told him to look there, to look for proof. I gave him Eleanor's letters, the ones hinting at George's cruelty and her own fears. Beatrice's voice cracked. I thought if he found proof of George's crimes, it might expose Isabel too, if she was involved. I never imagined Isabel was watching me." "How did she find out?" Miss Marple asked. "My diary," Beatrice whispered, fresh tears welling. "I kept it all those years. My guilt, my suspicions, my plans. I hid it in my room at the manor house when I visited Isabel after George's death. She must have found it, read it, understood that I knew everything about George and that I'd talked to Finch. She confronted me, not with anger, but with that terrible, calm smile. She said, 'Dear Beatrice, loyalty is such a precious commodity, and secrets, well, they are safest only shared with the dead. Mr. Finch seems determined to dig up graves. Perhaps he should be warned that some graves are best left undisturbed, for his own sake and yours.'" Beatrice shuddered violently. I knew she meant to kill him, and I knew she blamed me. I ran. I hid the diary at the dower house, hoping against hope that if anything happened to me, someone might find it. Then I heard about Finch, murdered in the vicarage garden. I knew it was her. I knew she'd come for me next. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of a mantelpiece clock and Beatrice's ragged breathing. The weight of her confession, the decades of fear and guilt, hung heavy in the air, thickened by the scent of tea and sorrow. Davies broke the silence, his voice gruff with emotion. "Miss Langley, your testimony, combined with the diary, the forensic evidence linking Isabel to the scenes, the forged letters, the clock, it's overwhelming. We have her. But we need to know about the attempt at the jail. Was that you, disguised?" Beatrice looked horrified. "Disguised? As a man? No. Oh, Inspector, no. I came straight here after retrieving the diary. I wouldn't dare go near the jail. Isabel has eyes everywhere. It must have been someone else, someone working for her. Or," she eyes widened in sudden dawning terror, "or it was Isabel herself, or someone she sent to silence me before I could talk. She must know I'm here. She must have followed me." Davies was on his feet instantly. "Peters, radio to the station. Double the watch on Isabel Fortescue, and get a team out here. Now! This place might not be as secure as we thought." He turned to Beatrice. "Miss Langley, stay here. Lock this door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Miss Marple. Understand?" Beatrice nodded frantically, clutching her rosary. Davies and Peters rushed out, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze fixed on Beatrice. The fear was back, raw and primal. "Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her voice calm amidst the rising panic. Who else might Isabel have? Who else knew enough, was loyal enough, or frightened enough to try this?" Beatrice wrung her hands. I don't know. Isabel kept her own counsel. Her maid, Jenny, she's devoted, but harmless? The gardener, old Thomas, He's been there forever, but he's just a gardener. Mr. Petherick? He handled the wills, but he seemed frightened of Isabel. I can't think of anyone she'd trust with something like this. As if summoned by the mention of his name, there was a sharp, urgent knock on the door. Beatrice gasped, recoiling. "Who is it?" Miss Marple called out, her voice steady. "It's Davies. Open up, quickly." Beatrice hesitated, looking to Miss Marple for reassurance. Miss Marple gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Beatrice scrambled to the door and unlocked it.
Davies burst in not alone. Flanked by two stern-faced constables, he was half dragging, half supporting a struggling figure. It wasn't a disguised woman. It was Mr. Petherick, the Fortescue family solicitor. His usually immaculate suit was rumpled, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wild with panic. He looked utterly broken. "Petherick," Davies snapped, shoving him into a chair. "Caught him trying to scale the back wall. Carrying this." Davies held up a small leather-bound book, identical in size and appearance to Beatrice's diary. A fake, blank pages. He was going to try and swap it. Isabel's orders, wasn't it? To silence Beatrice? To plant disinformation? Petherick crumpled, burying his face in his hands. "She made me," he wailed, his voice muffled and thick with tears. "She made me do everything. The letters, she watched me practice Haydock's handwriting for weeks. She threatened me, said she'd expose things about my past, about investments that would ruin me, send me to prison. She said she'd ruin my family. I had no choice. When she heard Beatrice was here, she got a message to me through a visitor, told me to come, to swap the diary, to deal with Beatrice if I had to." He broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Beatrice stared at him, a mixture of disgust and pity on her face. "You? You forged the letters? You helped her frame Haydock? You helped her cover up George's murders?" Petherick could only nod, his shoulders shaking with shame. Davies turned to Miss Marple, his expression grimly satisfied. "That's the last thread, Miss Marple. The web is completely unraveled. Isabel used Petherick's fear and past mistakes to make him her instrument. The forged letters, the attempt here today, all him, acting on her orders from her cell. We have him cold. He'll turn Queen's evidence against her in a heartbeat. She's finished, utterly finished." Miss Marple looked at the broken solicitor, then at the terrified but resolute Beatrice Langley clutching Eleanor's rosary, and finally at the damning fake diary in Davies' hand. The intricate, deadly tapestry Isabel Fortescue had woven over decades, a tapestry woven with greed, murder, blackmail, and the ruthless exploitation of human weakness, lay in tatters at their feet. Every thread was exposed: Emily Parker's murder, Lady Eleanor's poisoning, Sir George's assassination by aconite, Alistair Finch's precise execution, the forged letters, the manipulated clock, the desperate attempts to silence witnesses. "There is one final thing, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. She reached into her knitting bag one last time and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. "I believe it's from Isabel." Davies unfolded it. It was written in the same elegant and controlled hand as the forged blackmail letters, but this time the words were stark, devoid of manipulation, pure venom. "You think you've won, you meddling old fool? You've uncovered a few sordid details, nothing more. The Fortescue legacy is power. Power endures. Secrets can be buried deeper than any grave. Remember that when you sip your tea in your peaceful little cottage. The game is never truly over. It merely changes players." Davies crushed the note in his fist, a final threat, the last gasp of a trapped animal. "It changes nothing, Miss Marple. The evidence is overwhelming. She'll spend the rest of her life in a cell. Power? She has none left." "Perhaps not, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the convent gardens, visible through the window, bathed in the soft light of dusk. But her words are a reminder. Evil often wears a civilized face. It thrives in shadows, in secrets, and in the fear of good people. We have exposed this particular evil, yes, but the capacity for it, that remains, as does the need for vigilance. She looked at Beatrice, who was finally weeping quietly, not from fear, but from release, the rosary beads pressed to her lips, and the courage to remember the truth, even when it's painful, especially then. The final thread wasn't just the confession or the evidence or the broken solicitor. It was the understanding that the fight against darkness was ongoing, requiring not just deduction, but compassion, resilience, and the unwavering light of truth. Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag, the weight of it now feeling lighter. The intricate pattern of death was solved. The piece of St. Mary Mead, though scarred, could begin to mend. But Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that somewhere another shadow might be lengthening, another secret waiting to be whispered. And she would be ready, with her needles, her teacup, and her unflinching gaze into the heart of human nature. The game, as Isabel spitefully noted, was never truly over. But for now, in this quiet convent room, justice, fragile and hard-won, had prevailed.
Chapter 10. Peace Restored. The late autumn sun slanted across St. Mary Mead, casting long golden shadows that stretched across the dew-kissed lawns and gilded the remaining russet leaves on the village green. A fragile quiet had settled over the community, a quiet born of exhaustion and the slow, painful process of healing. The scandal of Isabel Fortescue's arrest, the shocking revelations of murder spanning decades, the public humiliation of Mr. Petherick, and the tragic figure of Beatrice Langley had left their marks. Yet, life, with its stubborn persistence, was reasserting itself. The butcher's boy whistled as he made his deliveries. Mrs. Price Ridley could be heard holding forth, albeit on less murderous topics, over her garden fence. And the vicar, Reverend Binnings, was once again tending his roses, though the peace bush where Alistair Finch fell had been carefully transplanted to a less conspicuous corner of the garden. Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the window of her cottage, a cup of steaming Darjeeling warming her hands. The rhythmic click of her knitting needles was a soothing counterpoint to the distant sounds of the village. The intricate pattern of the murder case, the web of lies woven by Isabel Fortescue, stretching back to Emily Parker's drowning and Lady Eleanor's poisoning, had been meticulously unpicked. The trial had been swift and conclusive. Isabel, her eerie composure finally fractured under the weight of evidence, the forged letters, the paint fleck, the clock tampering, Beatrice's damning diary and testimony, Petherick's grovelling confession, had been convicted of 3 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. She had received the severest sentence the law allowed, her reign of terror over, her fortune forfeited. Petherick, granted immunity for his testimony, was a broken man, his reputation in ruins, destined to live out his days in obscurity and shame. Beatrice Langley had found a fragile peace at St. Agnes's convent. She had chosen to stay, finding solace in the quiet routine and the opportunity for reflection. She spent her days in the convent library, meticulously cataloguing old manuscripts and occasionally tending the herb garden, a poignant irony given the role herbs had played in the tragedy. She had written to Miss Marple, a letter filled with quiet gratitude and a lingering sorrow, but also a sense of release.
Eleanor's rosary remained constantly in her possession, a tangible link to the sister she had failed to save, but whose memory she now honored with truth. Inspector Davies had called on Miss Marple just yesterday. He looked different, less brusque, more thoughtful, the perpetual frown line between his brows slightly softened. He'd brought a bottle of rather good sherry as a thank you. "Remarkable work, Miss Marple," he said, pouring them both a glass. "Truly remarkable. To see the pattern, the connections, Beatrice Langley, the diary, the clock, the monk's hood, I'd still be chasing shadows if not for you." He sipped his sherry. "The village, it's settling. Uneasily, perhaps, but settling. Dr. Haydock is slowly rebuilding his practice. People are coming back to him. Edward Fortescue, well, he's inherited what's left after the legal fees and restitution. He's selling the manor house, says he can't bear the sight of it. Can't say I blame him." Miss Marple had merely nodded, accepting the compliment with her usual quiet grace. "Justice has been served, Inspector. That is the main thing. Though the scars, they take longer to heal." Now, watching the sun begin its descent, Miss Marple felt a profound weariness, but also a deep sense of satisfaction. The intricate, deadly tapestry Isabel had woven had been torn apart, its dark threads exposed to the light. The village was safe, the victims remembered, the perpetrator punished. Peace, a hard-won and perhaps temporary state, had been restored. A gentle knock interrupted her reverie. It was Reverend Binnings, looking significantly better than he had in weeks, though a touch of sadness still lingered in his eyes. He carried a small posy of late-blooming chrysanthemums. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, stepping inside, "I hope I'm not disturbing your knitting." "Not at all, Reverend," Miss Marple smiled, setting her needles aside. Come in. Tea?" "I'd be delighted," Binnings replied, placing the flowers on her mantelpiece. "Just a quick visit, to thank you really, properly, for everything." He accepted the cup of tea she poured. "The garden, it's healing. We've replanted the rosebed near the gate, new roses, symbolic, I suppose." He gave a small, sad smile. "Esther finds it hard sometimes, walking past that spot, but we must move forward. As you said, the scars take time." "Indeed, Reverend," Miss Marple murmured, "but healing has begun. Beatrice Langley seems to have found some measure of peace at the convent." "Yes, Sister Mary Frances wrote to me. She says Beatrice has found purpose there. It's a mercy, after all she endured, to carry that knowledge, that guilt for so long." He sighed. "And Dr. Haydock? He called on us yesterday, brought a new tonic for Esther's nerves. He seemed humbler, grateful. The village is rallying around him slowly." "As they should," Miss Marple stated firmly. "He was an innocent pawn in Isabel's game. His reputation is intact, thanks to the truth." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea. The only sounds were the ticking of Miss Marple's mantelpiece clock and the distant chirping of sparrows settling for the night. "It's strange," Binnings said eventually, gazing out the window at the tranquil lane. "To think such darkness could exist here, in St. Mary Mead. It feels violated somehow, though I know that's irrational. Evil can flourish anywhere, given the right conditions. Secrets, greed, fear. Isabel Fortescue weaponized them all."
Human nature is constant, Reverend. The capacity for good, for evil, for self-deception, for courage, it exists in every village, every city. St. Mary Mead is no different. It simply wears a more benign face. But beneath the surface, she trailed off, her gaze distant. Beneath the surface, the currents run deep and sometimes dark. It is our task, I suppose, to shine a light when we can. And you did, Miss Marple, Bennings said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. You shone a very bright light indeed. You uncovered truths that had been buried for decades. You brought justice for Emily Parker, for Lady Eleanor in her own tragic way, and for poor Alistair Finch. You saved Beatrice Langley's life. The village owes you an immeasurable debt.
Miss Marple waved a dismissive hand, a faint blush colouring her cheeks. Nonsense, Reverend. I merely observed and listened. The pieces were there for anyone to see, if they knew where to look, and had the inclination to look. She picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly. The important thing is that peace has returned, that the village can heal, that the truth is known. They finished their tea, talking of inconsequential things, the upcoming harvest festival, the new curate's questionable taste in waistcoats, the health of Mrs. Price Ridley's prize-winning geranium. It was ordinary, gentle conversation, a balm for the extraordinary horrors they had navigated. As Bennings rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. Miss Marple, do you think it's truly over? Isabel is locked away, Petherick disgraced, Beatrice safe. But her last note to you, that threat. Miss Marple met his concerned gaze. Isabel Fortescue is a spent force, Reverend. Her power is gone. Her web is destroyed. Her words were the venomous spit of a crushed viper, empty. She can harm no one from behind prison walls. She paused, then added, her eyes holding that familiar, unnerving clarity. But evil, like a weed, has deep roots, and new seeds are always blowing on the wind. We must remain vigilant. But for now, St. Mary Mead is at peace. Let us cherish that. Bennings seemed to take comfort in her words. He nodded, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. Peace. Yes, thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. He let himself out. Miss Marple watched him walk down the path towards the vicarage, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. She finished her cup of tea, the warmth spreading through her. She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking a soft, reassuring rhythm in the quiet cottage. The intricate pattern of the murder was complete, its dark threads replaced by the simpler, stronger weave of justice and community healing. She glanced out the window, her gaze sweeping over her familiar garden, the lane beyond, the rooftops of the village. The sun had almost disappeared, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple. The first stars were beginning to prick through the velvet dusk. It was peaceful, serene, the way St. Mary Mead was meant to be. Then her eyes caught a movement. Across the lane, in the cottage that had stood empty for nearly a year, the one belonging to old Miss Tibbs, who had moved to live with her niece in Bournemouth, a light had flickered on. Not just a light, but the shadow of a figure moving past the window, a figure Miss Marple didn't recognize. Tall, slender, moving with a certain deliberateness, not the hesitant shuffle of someone new to the village, nor the bustling energy of a young family. This figure moved with a quiet intensity, a watchfulness that seemed out of place in the gentle twilight. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second.
She watched as the figure drew the curtains, not quickly, but slowly, carefully, as if ensuring no one outside could see in. The light was extinguished, leaving the cottage dark and silent once more. A slow, thoughtful smile touched Miss Marple's lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, nor of anticipation of trouble. It was a smile of profound understanding. The game, as Isabel spitefully noted, was never truly over. Human nature, with all its complexities, its hidden depths, its capacity for both kindness and malice, was a constant. New people brought new histories, new secrets, new possibilities. Peace was a precious, fragile thing, easily disturbed. She set her knitting down in her basket and picked up her empty teacup, holding it in her hands, as if it held the warmth of the village itself. She looked out at the darkened cottage across the lane, then up at the emerging stars. The intricate pattern of murder had been solved, the dark threads of that particular darkness neatly tied off, but the tapestry of life in St. Mary Mead continued to be woven, and somewhere, in the quiet shadows of a seemingly peaceful evening, a new thread, perhaps of a different hue, perhaps entirely innocent, perhaps not, had just been introduced. Miss Marple sighed, a sound not of weariness, but of quiet acceptance. She placed her teacup down, with a soft, definitive click. The peace was restored, yes, but Miss Jane Marple, with her lifetime of observing the minute details and the grand patterns of human behavior, knew with absolute certainty that even in the most tranquil of villages there were always mysteries waiting to be unravelled, and she would be here, with her needles, her teacup, and her unwavering gaze, ready to see them. The game, indeed, was never truly over, and for Miss Marple, that was simply the way of the world.